Hello, everyone. Omni-sensei here with What If I Was Reborn as Jon Snow the God Emperor? Game of Thrones. Part 3. If you enjoy this kind of content, please smash the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. I hope you enjoy listening to it. Fire and blood, they said. And that's what fell on the Dothraki army. It fell from the sky like the wrath of the gods. Varys spoke to the small council. Drogo, mounted on the largest and strongest horse in the Khalasar, watched the advancing and retreating armies with a cold, calm gaze. No matter how many of his soldiers died before him, he and all the others showed nothing but indifference to such deaths. It wasn't that they didn't feel anything, but in their eyes, the dead Dothraki rode the fire horses, stars, across the night sky with the horse god. How could they be sad in the face of such an honorable and glorious destiny as riding beside their god on horses of pure fire? Suddenly Drogo's eyes caught sight of at least half of the army breaking away from the main body and heading away from the great city. His first thought was that the enemy had become frightened and fled the battle. It was a thought that made him proud, but the second thought that crossed his mind was that the enemy had begun to set a trap. "Blood of my blood, what are your orders?" Drogo heard his bloodrider, Kohalo, ask with a calm and respectful expression. Drogo remained silent and looked at the men on horseback around him. He could see that they all wanted to hunt down the cowards and weaklings and kill them all. What if Drogo refused? He knew that he would be considered even weaker and more of a coward for not pursuing the fleeing enemy. Drogo made his decision in an instant, looked at everyone and spoke in a strong, unquestioning tone. "Pursue and kill the cowards in armor." Even if it was a trap, he, Khal Drogo, the call of the greatest Khalasar of his time, would still emerge victorious in the face of these cowardly and weak tactics. Shouts of joy and ferocity were heard as soon as everyone heard his call's decision. On the other side of the battlefield, Visenya watched half of the enemy army scatter and couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. Though the chances were slim, she and Bonero were still slightly worried that Khal Drogo might not do as they had planned. In the end, the strategy worked with an ease that surprised them. Arrogance and extreme self-confidence made one of the most powerful men in Essos fall into their traps with little difficulty. In the future, beware of pent-up arrogance. On the battlefield, only calm and wisdom can bring you victory. Visenya muttered to herself, learning every moment of this war. The problems and doubts she had when reading the books disappeared with every moment she took part in the war. That's the difference between a rookie and a veteran that was written in the books. She looked at the army of barbarians half her size and smiled. With the first part of her plan in the accomplished, all Visenya had to do was complete the second and run quickly to catch up with the allied army. Using her shield to block an arrow, Visenya advanced with her sword in hand, fighting like a Valkyrie on the battlefield. Her sword was fast and deadly, her steps erratic and hard to predict, and surprisingly she didn't mind playing dirty, using dust to blind her enemies or even kicking certain men in their most vulnerable parts. As a woman, she knew she could never match a man in strength and endurance, but she could make up for it with her speed and agility. Visenya simply used her strengths, augmented by the terrain and tactics that were unethical in the eyes of many of the lords and knights of Westeros. But did she care? The answer was no. One of the first things she learned from the books was that generals should use every tactic to defeat their enemies. The truth was always written by the victors and remembered by the people as their legacy. Wrong or not, it was necessary. Visenya plunged her sword into the neck of a Dothraki, snapping his throat and then kicking him in the stomach, knocking him to the ground. The man tried to stop the bleeding by placing his own hands on his throat, but it was a futile attempt as blood continued to pour from the wound. Visenya watched coldly as the life drained from his eyes, feeling nothing but indifference. She wouldn't feel sorry for her enemies, because her fate would be the same if it was the other way around, and maybe even worse because she was a woman. She didn't care about anything else as she moved forward, concentrating on killing the enemies in front of her. The 2,000 men around her protected her flanks, allowing Visenya to concentrate on what was in front of her while giving orders to her men. In the makeshift camp, nearly 12-year-old Daenerys could hear the war cries and the clash of metal from afar, but she didn't mind the noise, helping the Red Priestess bandage the wounded soldiers and sew up the cuts with needle and thread. Her blue dress was stained with blood around her belly. The girl's delicate face also bore traces of blood, especially on her cheeks, obviously none of her own, but that of the wounded. Helping others was the only thing she could do at the moment, as she couldn't take part in the war. The princess is very good at sewing wounds. Is she used to sewing or weaving? The Red Priestess commented with an expression of slight admiration as she watched Daenerys' skillful movements as she sewed the soldier's wounds. Sewing. Daenerys replied, running the needle through the soldier's skin and joining it to the other piece of skin. I was always the one who mended my mother's and sister's clothes while they were busy studying or working in taverns to make ends meet without attracting the attention of assassins or bad people. The Red Priest nodded and smiled. And you, what's your story? Daenerys asked without lifting her head, concentrating on stitching up the wounds of the soldier lying before her. Me? Just another harlot's daughter in Myr with no idea who my father was, a powerful lord or a commoner lucky enough to lie with my beautiful mother. The priestess commented with a smile. Because my mother didn't want me to suffer the same fate as her, she sold me to the Red Temple, where I became a priestess. Frankly, the woman's story didn't surprise Daenerys. It was something so common in Essos that you'd be surprised how rotten the human race could be. Daenerys asked no more questions, and when she had almost finished stitching the man up, she heard footsteps behind her, then a voice that sent shivers down her spine. Daenerys Targaryen, it seems you've gained a lot of courage lately, to the point of ignoring my orders and treating my concerns as nothing. Her hands covered in blood, Daenerys swallowed and turned to see the graceful figure of her mother standing before her. Her expression could be described as calm, but the girl knew that calm was the one thing that wasn't there. It was a silent rage, ready to explode at the slightest moment of carelessness. Mummy, you look so beautiful in that red dress, so beautiful that you could make the moon shine before you. Kind and intelligent words fell from the lips of the nearly 12-year-old girl in an instant, causing the Red Priestess to let out a melodious laugh. Even the man being stitched up smiled, despite the pain he felt at the moment. Your Grace, don't blame the princess. She has a kind heart and only wanted to help wounded men like me. The man spoke, trying to soothe the queen's anger. He was already flattered to have someone like Daenerys tend to his wounds. It was the least he could do to spare one of his rescuers a scolding from her mother. Riella might have believed the man's words had she not known her youngest daughter. Had she not threatened. She knew full well that Daenerys would have rushed to the battlefield to fight alongside her sister without hesitation. Just as the Queen Mother was about to speak, the sound of something distant caught her attention. It was a long guttural sound, accompanied by the thunder of wings flapping. It wasn't just Riella who heard it. Everyone in the camp raised their heads to see a smalt on the horizon approaching. The confused expressions on the faces of the people soon turned to pure shock, while others showed fanaticism. The Red Priestess, seeing what was coming, couldn't help but mutter to herself, remembering a verse from the Bible. Behold, he shall come, riding on a crimson beast, with the sword of light in his right hand. O Son of Light, his splendor shall fill the heavens, and at his coming he shall bring everlasting peace and abundant prosperity to the whole earth. Roar! A thunderous roar rang out in the sky as the gigantic Caraxes seemed to cover the heavens with its wings above them. Riella watched in utter disbelief as the giant crimson dragon swooped overhead, bringing with it winds and the smell of sulfur that for some reason reminded her of dragonstone. She didn't know how to describe the feeling she had when she saw the dragon. It was as if a long-cherished dream had come true. The dream of the Targaryen kings over the centuries was coming true before her eyes. Just as it had been her dream after more than a decade in exile. If House Targaryen had dragons, would the noble houses have the courage to rebel? The answer was a resounding no. Harrenhal Castle stood as proof of the power of House Targaryen's dragons. What fool would dare fight a dragon that could incinerate an entire city in minutes? And though she knew of the dragon's existence from Kinvara, knowing of the dragon's existence and seeing it in person were two very different things. Riella had to admit it was spectacular to see. She really wanted to know what it felt like to ride a dragon. She assumed it would be liberating. It was a creature capable of killing millions of people in a city, but she felt absolutely safe seeing it up close. Riella tried to see her grandson, but she couldn't see him clearly, catching a glimpse of white gold hair before the dragon was hundreds of yards away in the blink of an eye. Daenerys could only open her mouth in awe as she watched the huge crimson dragon soar above the camp. She was sure she would never forget the scene before her. She would always remember her nephew arriving to save them, just as he had a year and a half ago, when he managed to find a safe home for his family even on another continent. "Mummy, let's see," Daenerys said in an excited tone as she watched the crimson figure quickly disappear from her field of vision. Riella wore a struggling expression, but finally nodded. She wanted to see her grandson as soon as possible, even if she saw him burning tens of thousands of people. "Come on, I've come with a horse and we can head for the battlefield," she said, taking her daughter's hand and dragging her along, despite the blood on Daenerys' hands, dress and face. The Red Priestess and all the wounded didn't care about their own injuries, and all forced themselves to get up and head towards the battlefield. Although many had relatively serious injuries, absolutely no one wanted to miss the chance to see the Son of Light up close. Unlike Riella and Daenerys, who had admiration and joy in their eyes, the members of the Red Faith had only one thing: fanaticism and nothing else. On the battlefield, there was not a spot without a trace of blood on Visenya's body. The 18-year-old was completely drenched in blood, and yet she showed a satisfied smile. In that first shockwave, the attack of 11,000 men against 25,000 Dothraki went very well, and despite the relatively high casualties, they managed to kill at least almost 10,000 enemies. The number was so great because instead of swords, Visenya chose to use long spears to deal with the Dothraki cavalry. The spear barrier became particularly nightmarish for the Dothraki, who were unable to advance with their horses and had to fight on the ground like everyone else. Without the advantage of their horses' high mobility, the Dothraki, who couldn't get through the armor or get close to the Red Army because of the long spears, basically became targets to be shot at. Visenya was sure that, given a little more time, she could destroy the remaining 15,000 Dothraki still alive and exhausted at that moment. However, she soon discovered that she couldn't fulfill her dream of winning a legendary battle. The reason she couldn't was simple: the sky darkened and the thunderous sound of flapping wings caught the attention of everyone on the battlefield. Everyone looked up and panicked, or rather, the Dothraki for the first time showed expressions of fear and terror at being obscured by the gigantic wings. "Nephew," Visenya murmured, watching the greatest power in the world flying above her. The dragon was a deep shade of red crimson. Its size was breathtaking. It was practically a small flying hill. At the same time, a look of admiration shone in her violet eyes. She absolutely idolized the strong, especially a man who had a dragon as his nephew, who was not only intelligent, but also worthy of sitting on the Iron Throne. Seeing the dragon opening its mouth, Visenya opened her arms and muttered, "Fire and blood." The moment she muttered this, crimson flames gushed out of the dragon's mouth and descended upon the earth like an overwhelming funnel of flames, hitting the Dothraki. A moment before, Enar looked at the Dothraki army and showed no mercy in his actions. Dracarys. Caraxes obeyed his brother's request, and crimson flames fell on the Dothraki army as the crimson dragon flew above them. The flames consumed everything in front of them, be it men or horses, all of whom were reduced to mere ashes in an instant. What was left of these men was often only their feet, which were not hit so surely by the dragon's flames. Enar tilted his body to the side and Caraxes followed his movements, flying vertically in the air, circling the battlefield as the crimson dragon opened its mouth and spewed red flames at the Dothraki army. Wherever the flames touched, they left a trail in a straight line on the scorched earth blackened by the flames. Caraxes located a group slightly larger than ants and glided into the air, standing in a position in the air while flapping his wings. He opened his mouth and flames poured from his throat in a straight line, consuming all the enemies before him in an instant. After that, Caraxes landed on the ground with a loud and heavy thud. Without noticing, he crushed a Dothraki along with his horse with his paw and continued to burn anything that moved. The dragon's long tail didn't stand still, acting like a whip, killing anyone who dared approach it. The arrows shot at him didn't even scratch the scales hardened by the extreme heat of Caraxes' body. They didn't even tear the membrane of his wings, and all the arrows were shot far away. Enar looked at the entire battlefield now covered in red flames and couldn't help but take a deep breath. The disgusting smell of human flesh floated around him along with the ashes of the dead. At that moment, even though he didn't want to, he felt like the king of the world. How could he not? Perhaps this was every boy's dream, and here he was, killing tens of thousands of men in less than 5 minutes. Enar didn't enjoy this feeling for long. He commanded Caraxes and continued to kill everyone on the ground while the dragon's heavy footsteps echoed hundreds of meters away. From the saddle, Enar could see Caraxes' huge neck and his face changing direction every time he killed a Dothraki. There was something faintly resembling a sadistic smile on the dragon's draconic face. Through their bond, Prince Targaryen could feel Caraxes' extreme joy and sadism as if it were his own. It also brought Enar a feeling of happiness. It was the first time they had both acted so freely since they were born. How could they not be happy at this moment? Visenya, who gazed at the dragon amid the blood-red flames, spitting out even more red flames, had nothing but pure admiration and a longing to possess such power one day in her lilac eyes. At the same time, her eyes fell on the saddle, where even from hundreds of meters away, she could see the white gold hair and black armor along with a red cloak over his shoulders. Even though she was disappointed at not being able to destroy the entire Dothraki army, she was still incredibly happy to see the figure riding the dragon. It was her nephew, Prince Enar of House Targaryen. Sister. As Visenya looked at Caraxes and Enar, she heard an incomparably familiar cry. She looked back and saw a galloping horse rapidly approaching on the battlefield, dodging the bodies of the dead men and horses. She immediately recognized her mother and sister. Looking at the state of her daughter wearing armor and covered in blood, Riella couldn't help but let out a helpless sigh. Apart from her grandson, would anyone really marry her daughter? Yes, she planned to marry her daughter to her grandson, not just Visenya, but Daenerys too. The likely birth of the dragons was the main reason for her taking such a drastic decision. She would in no way allow the scenario that happened at the Dance of the Dragons to happen again. Only House Targaryen could have dragons and no one else. Only a united family could bring her back all that her ancestors had conquered before her. However, she put these thoughts aside and focused on the scene happening in front of her and truly understood why Aegon and his sisters/wives had managed to bring a continent to its knees before House Targaryen. The scene of one person and a dragon destroying an entire army was truly a sight for sore eyes. Such a sight might not be so rare in modern times where there were nuclear bombs, but in the world of Planetos, it was a truly shocking sight, especially after the fall of ancient Valyria and the disappearance of the dragons. He's flying again. Daenerys exclaimed in regret for not knowing her sweet nephew, her lilac eyes staring at the crimson dragon taking flight and heading in the opposite direction of Volantis City. Visenya and Riella also looked regretful, but they didn't stay that way for long, especially Visenya, who was one of the generals on the battlefield. Forward, troops! She shouted, and her orders were passed on in less than 5 minutes. Although Benero's strategy couldn't be completed because of her nephew, she still wanted to see him incinerate all the enemy Dothraki. The troops advanced on Visenya's orders without any hesitation, something impossible to happen before this war took place. But it became possible when everyone saw how she fought alongside them regardless of her special status. Riella's eyes widened seeing this. For the first time in almost 20 years, she noticed that her daughter was no longer a frightened little girl always seeking refuge in her arms on stormy nights, but had become a powerful woman who could command tens of thousands of men. Mother, let's follow Visenya. Riella awoke from her stupor at her youngest daughter's words, nodding as she grabbed the reins of her horse and followed the army, passing through the field of fire before her, the red flames still burning faintly on the ground along with the ashes of the dead. Enar didn't know that his family was watching him as he flew with Caraxes towards the second enemy army miles away. Honestly, such a strategy was really suitable to fight these Dothraki, but only if you had a powerful army. Otherwise, splitting your troops wasn't a very smart strategy on the battlefield. 5 minutes later, Enar saw two armies clashing. Excited shouts full of savagery could be heard from afar, and even if he didn't know anything, he could assume it was the Dothraki. There was no other ethnic group in the world as warlike as the Dothraki. Benero, who wore red and gold armor, held a hammer covered in flames as he killed everyone with ease. The warhammer sank into his enemies' chests and then smashed their heads, exploding them like Melanikas, spilling blood and brain tissue everywhere. His face was calm, but everyone could see the happiness in his eyes. The reason for his happiness was very simple. The cloud of smoke rising into the sky could be seen from miles away. It didn't take a genius to know who had arrived and probably destroyed the second Dothraki army. To the Son of Light! Benero shouted, causing everyone around him to shout at the same time. To the Son of Light! For the Son of Light! To the Son of Light! The morale of the army soared even higher at that moment, the soldiers seeming to have used Pervitin as they advanced with a confidence and fearlessness of death that shocked even the Dothraki, as if it were the first time they had seen someone braver than themselves. Both armies stopped, however, when they noticed that the sky had gone completely dark. Everyone looked up and grew pale in front of the gigantic creature in the sky. The creature's demonic grin was particularly terrifying, and flames spewed from its mouth, falling upon the Dothraki like the wrath of the gods. The Red Army retreated to avoid the dragon's flames and watched in utter fanaticism as a story from the Bible unfolded before them. Enar didn't care about the Red Army and focused on the Dothraki army, killing as many as he could in as little time as possible. Caraxes flew extremely low as his mouth spewed red flames that turned everything in front of him to ash. As he rode around the battlefield, Enar's quick eyes caught sight of a small group of interesting Dothraki, because unlike the others, this small group looked at him and Caraxes without any fear. The leader of the small group, who was mounted on the largest and strongest horse, looked directly at him. "Khal Drogo." A whisper escaped Enar's lips, guessing his identity in an instant. The things this man would do to his family made fury bubble up in his chest. Sensing Enar's rage, Caraxes let out an equally furious roar and suddenly changed direction in the air, his huge body having no trouble doing such a maneuver in the air. Without any hesitation on Carax's part, blood-red flames poured out of his mouth, trying to incinerate the ants that had dared to make his brother angry. However, unlike what he had expected, the ants seemed to be prepared and quickly fled the scene. Suddenly, Enar, who was paying attention to Khal Drogo, reached forward and grabbed the arrow, which would have hit him in the eye if he hadn't held it. "Caraxes, get down." Enar spoke in High Valyrian, and Caraxes obeyed, landing 100 meters from Khal Drogo and his Bloodriders. Enar descended from Caraxes through the iron net and fell to the ground with both feet on the ground. He drew both swords, wielding them in both hands. Lady Laia and Dark Sister came out of their sheaths with a sharp, cutting sound. Looking around, the crimson fire still burned around him, creating almost a fighting ring made of dragon fire. Enar didn't need to say anything. His actions practically said what he wanted. As he had imagined, Khal Drogo rode his horse through the red flames in an instant. He got off his horse and drew his arak, his brown, almost black eyes fixed on the man who had destroyed his Khalasar, riding a huge fire horse with a calm gaze. "I will bathe in your blood, and your head will be one of my trophies." Drogo spoke, but in his own language, something Enar understood because he knew his own. "Your head will also be a great trophy. I'll give it to the dogs. Something like that is worthy for the scum that you and your people are." Enar replied in the same language as Drogo, not hiding his contempt, disdain and disgust at the Dothraki's actions. Not only were his people despised, but so was he. Drogo felt a violent flare of anger in his chest hearing the boy's words. He had never been so despised since he was born. Drogo wasted no more time. He advanced with his arak. He quickly covered the distance of 100 meters in less than 10 seconds. Clang! Khal Drogo's blade was blocked by Lady Laia's. Sparks blossomed as the two blades met. Enar felt his arms tremble slightly at the impact of the two swords. Although he despised the customs of the Dothraki, he had to admit that the man in front of him was extremely strong. The Targaryen prince didn't remain in a bladed stalemate for long. In his other hand, Dark Sister made a horizontal move, attacking the Khal without any hesitation in her actions. Drogo sidestepped by moving his body to the side and attacked with surprising agility, causing Enar to use Lady Laia to block the Khal's attack once again. Enar didn't back down and thrust his sword forward with force and suddenly kicked Drogo in the stomach with his leg covered by the plate armor. A grunt escaped the Khal's lips, but the man didn't flinch despite the blow, nor did Enar. Both engaged in a wild exchange of swords and blows amidst the sea of fire around them. Clang! 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 The sound of swords seemed to echo across the battlefield. What was left of the Dothraki army watched in silence as their leader dueled in the middle of the sea of fire and blood. The same was happening with the Red Army, all of whom watched the Son of Light fight with a fanatical gaze. It was the first time they had all seen him, and what they saw satisfied all their imaginations of how the Son of Light would appear. It was everything they had hoped for, and more. Not long afterwards, The army led by Visenya arrived and joined the army led by Bonero. The Red Archbishop Bonero looked at the girl covered in blood and nodded in respect. "It seems that our plan cannot be successfully completed, Princess." Even as he said this, there was no sense of regret on his face. On the contrary, there was a gentle, warm smile on his lips. How could he be unhappy at finally meeting his Messiah and the whole religion of the Red Faith? Visenya was smiling too, her eyes fixed on the two figures fighting in the sea of crimson fire with a look of adoration in her violet eyes. Fast, strong and brutal. The exchange of swords was so intense that the first to make the slightest mistake would be mortally wounded. The sound of metal colliding and the sparks in the air in the sea of fire seemed like a scene straight out of the epic tales of the Age of Heroes. Incredible! Daenerys, riding with her mother on the horse, couldn't help but exclaim aloud, her lilac eyes widening at the sight of the epic struggle before her. "Kill him, nephew!" Daenerys shouted loudly, so much to encourage her sweet nephew in this deadly fight. Riella looked at her daughter and couldn't help but let out another helpless sigh. Although she loved her daughters, she sometimes felt that Rhaegar was more restrained than her daughters. Enar, who was fighting Drogo, heard the girl's excited voice and couldn't help but flash a gentle smile. "Looks like I'll have to make an effort not to disappoint my little aunt." Enar thought as he became even more aggressive in his attacks. If before his attacks had been swift and brutal, now they became insidious and extremely fast, always aiming at an angle that was difficult to defend against, to the point where only the light escaping in the air could prove that he was attacking. And even more surprising was Drogo, who could keep up with his attacks with his wealth of fighting experience. The two swords tore through the air at high speed as they clashed violently against Drogo's arak. However, unlike Enar's swords, which were made of Valyrian steel and star steel, Drogo's sword was far from being able to withstand so many blows from such tough and sharp swords. Then, before Enar's unsurprised eyes, Drogo's arak collided violently with Lady Leia once again, shattering into dozens of pieces before Drogo's eyes. The Dark Sister seized the moment and slashed at Drogo's shoulder, tearing through flesh and bone as if she were slicing butter. It left a 20-inch gash from his shoulder to his stomach. His organs were visible through the wound as blood gushed from it. Drogo calmly looked at the wound and ignored it as he advanced on Enar, trying to knock him to the ground. But foreseeing the future with his prescience, the Targaryen prince calmly backed away as he saw the man trying to approach him with his internal organs protruding from his body. Drogo couldn't take 3 steps forward and fell to his knees, breathing heavily, blood staining his body in large quantities. He raised his head and looked with difficulty at the young man approaching him with 2 swords, one in each hand. "I'm not saying I'll remember you as a worthy man, but I will remember you as a warrior." Enar spoke calmly as the 2 swords touched Drogo's neck in the shape of scissors. Drogo showed nothing but calm and spat on Enar's black armor. Enar narrowed his eyes and moved both swords at the same time, cutting off Drogo's head. His head fell as his body remained kneeling on the ground before him. Grabbing his head by the hair, Enar raised his head to the sky as a tsunami of excited, joyous shouts rang out around him. It was the Red Army, shouting and screaming in celebration of their great victory. Suddenly, Enar heard the sound of approaching horses and saw Drogo's bloodriders approaching rapidly on horseback, arak in hand. The Targaryen prince was not surprised by the bloodriders' actions. He knew their ways and understood that they would all die for their call. Before Enar could do anything, Caraxes snaked around him, protecting him, and opened his mouth full of huge teeth. Deep in his throat, flames could be seen building up before spewing out of his mouth in a funnel of extremely hot, destructive flames. All of Drogo's bloodriders were consumed and turned to ashes in a matter of seconds under the dragon's red flames. Enar let out a sigh, knowing it was all over and he could relax for a moment. He looked at the head in his hand and placed it on the ground in front of Drogo's kneeling body, muttering to himself, "Burn in hell with your sins, Lord of Horses." Looking at the flames that had almost ceased to exist, Enar raised his sword and spoke loudly. "You have orders. Seek out and destroy all enemies." Enar shouted loudly, his voice spreading through the surroundings with a powerful, regal tone. What followed was a tsunami of deafening voices. "Yes, Prophet." With their shout, the Red Army advanced towards the remnants of the Dothraki. They had only one objective: to complete the first order given by the Son of Light. Enar smiled gently and stroked Carax's neck, feeling incredibly satisfied with what they had just done. Although Jon Snow was free, he was, after all, just another insignificant piece in this unchanging world before the powers of the gods. He, Enar Targaryen, was different. He would break the wheel of fate and make this world move forward again. He would become a god to these people and make the human race survive until his last day. Tyrant, despot or monster, he wouldn't do right or wrong. He would do what was necessary. Caraxes let out a comfortable guttural sound and lay down on the ground while staring at Enar with his gigantic red eyes, which resembled hot coals. Just like his knight, there was a sense of pleasure and satisfaction in his eyes. It was the first time that Caraxes could finally unleash his true warlike and sadistic nature. So like Enar, the Crimson Dragon was as incredibly relaxed at this moment as he had ever been. Suddenly, Enar heard two horses approaching and turned while still stroking the scales on Carax's neck. In front of him appeared three women riding two horses. Enar let out a sigh and smiled warmly. "Looks like it's the first time we've met in person." Enar spoke with a joking tone, but before he could notice, there was someone in front of him. She was a relatively tall woman, but not very tall, barely reaching his chest, and she had the characteristic hair and eyes of House Targaryen. Her lilac eyes gazed at him with a look of emotion, and with tears already welling up in her eyes. "You look so much like your father," Riella said, reaching out and grasping her grandson's face with both hands. Even though she didn't want to cry, she found herself feeling the tears slide down her cheeks. Without hesitation, she didn't wait for Enar's response and hugged him tightly, resting her head on his cold armor-covered chest, despite feeling nothing but warmth and security. She just wanted to embrace her son's legacy right now. Enar blinked and hesitated, but stroked her hair affectionately. "Sorry I'm late, dear grandmother." Enar spoke with a slightly guilty tone. If he had arrived faster, the fights that had already taken place wouldn't have needed to happen. "No matter, I'm glad you're safe and healthy," Riella replied, wiping the tears from her eyes. For her, there was nothing happier than her family being safe and healthy. Essos, Volantis, the first daughter. Enar was preparing to break his daily fast when he heard someone knocking on his door. Seeing in the mirror that there was no flaw in his clothes, he answered, "Come in." As soon as his words sounded, the door was opened and a platinum-haired woman entered the room with a very happy expression. "Grandmother." Enar greeted the woman with a warm smile on his face. Riella couldn't help looking at her grandson and smiled even more. If she hadn't known that her grandson was the same age as her youngest daughter, she could easily have mistaken him for a young adult of 16 or 17. He was very tall, measuring around 186 centimeters in height, 6 feet 1 inch, his slightly muscular body visible through the baggy red tunic he was wearing at the moment, which sported a cleavage at the chest, showing off a defined and streamlined abdomen. He was just the right amount of muscular not to have extremely bulging muscles. As for his face, there was nothing to talk about. As the son of the man considered the most handsome in Westeros, Enar's face was simply too beautiful. Riella was sure that his looks alone could be the dream of many a lattice still single or even married in Westeros. "Are you feeling well? Have you rested well?" Riella asked with a worried tone as she searched for any trace of exhaustion from the battle that had taken place the day before. Even now, the town was still noisy, everyone discussing the battle that had begun to be referred to as the Second Field of Fire. Riella thought it was a very apt name, especially thinking about how many had died the night before, ashes falling from the sky like raindrops. Faced with his grandmother's concern, Enar replied in an amused tone, "Don't worry, the biggest job was done by my brother, Caraxes." Riella couldn't help but notice the term used to refer to the dragon, proving that her grandson and the dragon shared a very strong bond and considered each other brothers. This brought a smile to her lips. "Would you like to walk with me? I'll go see Caraxes, and then we'll break our fast together," Enar said, inviting Riella to walk with him, something Riella accepted without a second thought. She wanted to learn as much about Enar as possible, to at least try to make up for lost time between them. As she walked through the corridors towards the outermost part of the Great Temple, Riella noticed something that she found very worrying. When everyone looked at Enar, they weren't looking at a king, but at a god, a look of worship and reverence. Even the guards following them looked as if they would give their lives for her grandson at any second. Riella's fears were realized when a mother approached holding her daughter. "Can the Messiah bless my daughter?" the mother asked, showing her daughter, who was no more than a few years old. Einar wasn't surprised and held the girl with a gentle smile and kissed her forehead. "God bless her. She will be a strong and healthy child." The woman smiled, took her daughter and bowed, then walked away with a broad smile on her face. After the woman, others began to gather around Einar. All members of the Red Faith, all trying to touch him or ask for a blessing. At one point, Riella felt trapped and suffocated by the amount of people gathering around them. Fortunately, this only lasted a few moments before the guards surrounded her and her grandson, forming a protective ring around them. Looking at Einar's perfectly normal face, Riella couldn't imagine how her grandson could remain perfectly normal in the face of such an absurd scene. It wasn't that Einar minded such things, but scenes like this would be very normal in the future, especially in Essos, less so in Westeros, but even more so when the long night came. He was the spiritual pillar of the people and would have to get used to many treating him as a godlike figure. Under the protection of dozens of guards, Einar and Riella finally managed to leave the Great Temple. "Are you okay? Don't you feel uncomfortable?" Riella asked with an unreadable expression on her face. Though she had realized it before, living in the Great Temple for nearly 2 years had only confirmed her earlier suspicions that the entire Red Faith had its core in her grandson. How this was possible, or even how it happened, she had no idea. It was so crazy and unreal that Riella wondered if all these people were mad. "I'll get used to it," Einar replied with a smile on his face, but Riella could tell that he carried a responsibility that she didn't know how many times heavier than her own. The walk to the training ground where Caraxes lay was quiet. There weren't many people around, and those who were there were kept at bay by the Red Guards. Riella listened with pleasure to Einar's childhood story, regretting that a Targaryen prince had been raised as a bastard. When she heard how Einar was treated by Catelyn, a rage bubbled up in her chest. If there was one thing she was, it was someone who protected her family. When she returned to Westeros, she would make that woman suffer little, but she wouldn't kill her because she was the wife of the Lord Paramount of the North, who was now an ally of House Targaryen. Riella's expression didn't escape Einar's eyes, and he felt his heart warm to see her act with such fury at the way he was being treated by Catelyn Stark. When Einar and Riella were close to the training field, they both saw 2 small figures spying on the gigantic dragon from behind a pillar. Getting closer to the 2 figures, Einar and Riella overheard their conversation. "I want to fly on it," the platinum-haired girl commented with a tone full of longing. "What if the princess falls? It doesn't seem very safe." The second girl commented with a worried tone. "Don't be a coward, Missandei. Imagine how cool it is to fly on a dragon." The platinum-haired girl retorted to the other girl's words. "I don't see how flying on a dragon is cool. It looks like it's going to eat me at any moment." Missandei replied, looking at the gigantic beast that had burned tens of thousands of people alive in less than an hour. Riella stroked her forehead listening to her youngest daughter's words. She looked at her grandson and saw that he was smiling with a playful smile on his lips. Letting out a sigh, Riella called out to her daughter, "Daenerys." Hearing her name being called, Daenerys, who had woken up early to see Caraxes, turned around startled and saw her mother looking at her with a scolding look. However, her gaze soon settled on the young man next to her mother. "Nephew." Showing an excited look, Daenerys approached her family and greeted them with a joy that was simply contagious. Missandei, seeing Einar, simply bowed her head as if she had done something wrong, which by the way she had, since Einar didn't allow anyone to approach Caraxes without permission. Einar knew that the dragon hated any strangers approaching him. To prevent anyone from becoming dragon food, he had to stop everyone from approaching Caraxes. Looking at her unarmored nephew, Daenerys' eyes couldn't help but light up. Einar in armor gave off a majestic and regal air, but in normal, comfortable clothes, he gave off an air of regal elegance, but much more approachable. Combine that with his simply beautiful appearance, and you have someone who can make your young heart beat extremely fast. While Daenerys looked at Einar, Einar also looked at Daenerys. Daenerys had the typical Targaryen features, a fine, delicate, almost supernatural beauty. She was slender and petite, with large lilac eyes and thin, pale porcelain, almost translucent skin. She looked like a porcelain doll. Einar had to admit, his family was really beautiful to the point of making anyone wonder why God loved the Valyrians so much. "Hello, my little aunt." Stroking her hair affectionately, Einar greeted her with a gentle smile. Daenerys was really small, barely big to reach his belly. Daenerys pouted at being treated like a child, just like her mother treated her. Putting her hands on her waist, she puffed out her still-developing melons and spoke in a tone that tried to sound as adult as possible. "Sweet nephew, we're the same age. Don't treat me like a child." Einar almost couldn't help herself and started laughing. Trying his best to show a serious expression, he spoke in an apologetic tone even though he was smiling. "Forgive me, dear aunt. I didn't mean to offend you with my words." "You're forgiven, but only if you introduce me personally to Caraxes." Showing a cunning expression, Daenerys finally revealed her true intention, making Riella roll her eyes. The closer she got to the dragon, the faster Daenerys' heart beat. She could smell the sulfur and smoke, which might be an unpleasant smell to many, but she found it very pleasant. She watched as her nephew stroked the creature's long neck, and the dragon simply melted to his caresses, as if it were a cat as big as a hill and spitting fire. When she got close enough, Daenerys saw the dragon's eyes fall on her, red eyes that resembled hot coals from a bonfire. She was completely paralyzed as the dragon brought its head close to her and began to sniff her, as if discovering something interesting. Unlike the fear one would feel in such a situation, Daenerys just laughed. She wanted to hug the dragon's snout but hesitated, not wanting to disturb it. But suddenly her hand was caught by another and brought to the dragon's scales. Feeling the touch transmitted through her hand, Daenerys opened her mouth and looked directly into the dragon's eyes, which were staring back at her. "Don't be afraid, Caraxes likes you." Daenerys heard her nephew's deep melodious voice behind her and realized it was he who had forced her to touch the dragon's scales. "It's beautiful, nephew," she commented with an emotional tone. Never in her life had she thought that a nephew could do what she was doing, caress a giant dragon. "I think he liked being called powerful instead of handsome." Einar commented in an amused tone, really liking Daenerys and Riella's reaction to seeing Caraxes so close. The astonishment on their faces, even if it wasn't the first time they saw him, was really interesting. "Yes, you're a very strong and very handsome boy." Daenerys laughed at Einar's joke and spoke, stroking the scales warmly to the touch and adding something else to the last part of her speech. Turning to Einar, Daenerys used the deadliest weapon she possessed, a cute, pleading look. She grasped Einar's hand and asked in a tone full of pleading and adoration, "Nephew, can you take me flying on Caraxes?" Riella rolled her eyes at her daughter's performance. She knew that her daughter could be manipulative whenever she wanted, like right now. Unfortunately, she wasn't immune to that look, which was simply impossible to defend against. "All right, but some other time." Einar didn't refuse. How could he do that in front of that look? Daenerys couldn't hold back her smile any longer and let out a graceful laugh. After saying goodbye to Caraxes, the three family members, along with Missandei, remained silent throughout the walk. Although she was spying on Einar, just as Daenerys was doing at that moment. Arriving at the place where they would have breakfast, Einar was not surprised to see Kinvara and Benerro present. "Son of the Light." Kinvara bowed and greeted Einar with all possible respect and devotion, as did Benerro. "You and Benerro have done an excellent job. The Red Faith has grown a lot in these almost 6 years." Einar wasn't stingy with his praise. Both of them had really done more than he had expected. The Red Faith had grown so much that he was satisfied with the results of these almost 6 years. "It is an honor to help the Messiah with his concerns." Benerro replied with an even more pious tone than Kinvara, if that was possible. The man looked at Einar as if he considered him his god. "Let's talk business while we eat," Einar said as he sat down in the main chair. They all nodded and sat down at the table. Just as Einar was about to speak, another figure walked through the door. It was Visenya, and unlike the day before, she wasn't covered in blood, so Einar could see what his aunt looked like. Frankly, he couldn't believe that the sweet, gentle-looking girl before him was the same person he had seen covered in the blood of men and horses. Visenya simply embodied the phrase, "Don't judge a book by its cover." She and her actions were complete opposites, but he had to admit that he found her incredibly attractive covered in blood. Perhaps his preference for women was influenced by Queen Visenya and Queen Rhaenys, who made him prefer strong women to beautiful vessels. Visenya was a young woman of 18, with long straight platinum hair that fell down her back in a cascade of shiny strands. Beautiful violet eyes that had a warm look in them. Her features were naturally elegant, sweet, and gentle. There was a slightly shy smile on her plump, red lips. Mother, sister, Reverend Mother, Archbishop, and nephew. Visenya greeted everyone with a smile on her lips. Sorry I'm late, I overslept. Don't apologize, Aunt. I still have to thank you for your actions in the war. Enar spoke with a sincere tone of admiration for Visenya's actions. He could count on his hands how many women had the courage, bravery, and determination to do what she had done. The smile on Visenya's lips grew as she listened to his words. The worry she'd had before vanished completely at that moment. Her fear was that Enar wouldn't like a woman on the battlefield, but seeing the look of genuine admiration in his eyes, she felt her heart beat faster. She didn't disagree with her mother's decisions. Marrying Enar seemed right and could strengthen House Targaryen, making it more united than ever. So she hoped for a happy relationship, and seeing that Enar wasn't against her being on the battlefield eased 80% of her worries. Not knowing what Visenya was thinking, Enar looked at Kinvara and asked as she took the cup of juice and raised it to her lips. Is the armor I ordered ready? Kinvara replied without hesitation. Fortunately, I have successfully fulfilled your request, Your Grace. A satisfied look appeared on Enar's face. Armor? Daenerys asked curiously, and it wasn't just her who was curious. Riella and Visenya also looked at Enar with curious eyes. Enar's lips curved into an amused smile. The armor was made for Caraxes. His words startled the three women and everyone else present, and the image of a dragon wearing plate armor appeared in their minds. Isn't it too heavy? Visenya asked, puzzled. In her eyes, armor the size of Caraxes could provide the steel for an entire army, not to mention the weight. Could the dragon fly with such heavy armor? It's not full armor, but armor that will cover Caraxes' neck and a helmet to protect his eyes. Enar answered the questions of everyone at the table. Although the chance of something similar to what happened to Meraxes is minuscule, I decided to put on armor to protect the fragile parts of the dragon. Note, an armor similar to Saphira's armor in Aragon. Yes, Enar was worried that something similar might happen to Caraxes. Dorne's lucky shot that hit Meraxes was almost impossible to repeat, but he didn't want to risk his brother's life on something like luck. Our enemies will probably surrender immediately when they see a dragon in armor. Visenya commented in an amused tone. The very existence of the dragon was disturbing to everyone. Imagine the expressions of the lords of Westeros when they saw the armor covering the dragon. Many of them wouldn't have the courage to tell him that. Unfortunately, I still haven't managed to hatch the 3 dragon eggs. Daenerys commented with a slightly discouraged expression. Although the dream the night before had given her a hint, it was hard to believe if it was really a hint or just a strange dream. It doesn't matter, I know you'll make it, Aunt. Enar spoke with a smile. Seeing the unconditional trust he had in her made Daenerys herself feel happy and sweet. Her pale cheeks flushed, and she let out a happy laugh. Seeing that look, Riella sighed, knowing that her grandson had captured Daenerys' heart. But she wasn't surprised. Her daughter already had a good impression of Enar. Along with her looks, her kindness, and Enar's confidence in her, it was easy for a girl her daughter's age to fall in love. Riella didn't object. On the contrary, she even encouraged her 2 daughters. A family united in adversity was a strong and cohesive family. The days in Essos were hot and the nights were even colder. At night, in Riella's room, all 4 members of House Targaryen gathered around the fireplace, which burned with orange flames. Enar leaned against the side of the fireplace, holding a goblet of wine. Wine that was very weak, like almost all drinks in this world. One of the reasons people had to drink a lot to get really drunk. Enar was in his grandmother's room with his aunts for a very simple reason. He wanted to explain that the war wasn't just about the throne, but about the fate of humanity's survival. And he couldn't do it alone. He needed people he could trust on his side. First of all, what I'm about to say may shock you, but I hope you'll listen quietly and wait to ask questions when I'm done." Einar spoke, his expression serious and dignified. All three women listened intently to his words. "To begin, I must tell you why Aegon and his wives conquered Westeros in the first place. Before the conquest, Aegon had a dragon dream, the same kind of dream that Daenerys the Dreamer had and saved House Targaryen from extinction, unlike the 39 houses of dragon lords that disappeared along with Valyria." Einar spoke and continued. "A prophetic dream spoke of a winter that would devastate the world of men, and that to survive such a calamity a Targaryen must rule the Seven Kingdoms. According to Aegon I, the promised prince would come from his line to fight the coming darkness. Winter was coming, and with it death," Einar said, looking at the shocked faces of the three women. He wasn't talking about just any winter, but the second long night, years without sun and monsters rising from the darkness of the world. And in the north of Westeros, a being who was able to revive the dead and make them fight alongside him was coming with an army of hundreds of thousands of undead, who don't need to eat or rest and are immortal. Einar gripped the wine glass tighter and brought it to his lips, drinking the entire contents in one gulp. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and finished speaking. "Not only do we have to survive years without sun and years without crops, but also the monsters born of the world's darkness and an army of nearly immortal undead, all in less than a decade." Riella didn't know what to say in the face of such a shocking revelation. She wanted to open her mouth and say that her grandson was exaggerating, but when she looked into his eyes, his deep purple eyes, she seemed to see a look that made her shiver with fear. The queen hugged herself to warm herself, but the cold feeling didn't seem to go away. "The undead army is confirmed. Beyond the wall, all the savages are migrating on a large scale heading south to escape the White Walkers and their leader, the Night King." Einar spoke again. "These things only die for three things in the world: dragon fire, Valyrian steel, and dragonglass, obsidian." Visenya's face couldn't have been more serious listening to the White Walker's weaknesses. They were few and worse, extremely rare, especially the first two items, dragonfire and Valyrian steel. As for dragonglass, she had never seen any in her life. Daenerys could be considered the most relaxed person at this moment. She didn't doubt her nephew's words for a minute. In her eyes, ever since she had learned of this nephew's existence, she had only thought that she was facing a legendary character just like the one described in the Age of Heroes books. As for the prophecy of Aegon I, the Conqueror, she only felt that she would do as her ancestors wanted, fight for the survival of humanity together with her nephew. Seeing his serious and dignified face faintly illuminated by the flickering light of the flames, Daenerys approached him and took his hand. "Sweet nephew, don't worry, we're family and we'll fight by your side, and even if only a little, we'll carry some of the burden on your shoulders. Aegon had his wives/sisters, and you have us, your brave aunts and an old woman not very good with a sword." Daenerys spoke, looking straight into Einar's eyes. Einar looked stunned at the girl, who was gazing at him with an intensity that could make anyone evaporate from the earth. However, the serious and dignified atmosphere was broken by Rhaella Targaryen's voice. "Daenerys Targaryen, who are you calling an old woman?" The words came out of Rhaella's lips as an angry snarl, causing Daenerys to laugh and start fleeing across the room while being chased by her mother. Looking at Einar's stunned expression, Visenya sat down next to him and rested her head on his shoulder. "Don't worry, they've both always been like this. Daenerys can annoy our mother like no other person can." She spoke with a soft, gentle tone, hard to associate with the same young woman capable of killing men without any hesitation. Looking at Visenya using her body as a support and her shoulder as a pillow, Einar felt his lips lift in a smile. He took a lock of the young woman's silver hair and kissed it under her somewhat shy eyes. "Thank you, you have no idea how much your trust in me and believing everything I've said so far means to me." He spoke with a gentle tone. Einar didn't know how many years he hadn't been as relaxed as he was at this moment. Having someone to share his burden, even a little, was simply relaxing. He knew how crazy it was that people believed his words, but seeing his family believe him made him realize that someone without a family was someone without a place to stand in an ocean of worries. Suddenly, Daenerys appeared at Einar's side and grabbed his arm as she spoke. "That's not fair. Don't leave me out of the hug." Her face showed a little sweat from running. Daenerys took a lock of her hair and gave it to Einar, much to his confusion. "You kissed Visenya's hair. you must kiss mine." She spoke with an unquestioning tone, as if she wouldn't allow him not to kiss her hair as well as Visanya's. Einar smiled and kissed her hair just as he had Visanya's, earning a satisfied look from the girl who cuddled up to him, practically pushing half of her body on top of his, using him as a pillow without any shame. Watching the scene, Riella's lips curved into a gentle, tender smile, feeling that she could trust Einar with her daughters without worry. She could see that he was a good man and worthy of being her daughter's husband. Uncle Eamon was right. A Targaryen alone in the world is a terrible thing. Einar muttered to himself, surrounded by the two women, but his whisper was heard by all three. "Uncle Eamon?" Daenerys asked curiously, looking at her nephew with a bright gaze, for the name was a typical Valyrian one. Maester Aemon Targaryen, son of Mikar I Targaryen. He still lives and serves as Maester of Castle Black on the Wall, though he is nearly 100 years old. Einar responded by stroking Daenerys' hair, who practically melted under his caresses and leaned against his body without a care in the world. "Uncle Eamon is alive," Riella said in shock. Einar wasn't surprised by Riella's incredulous words. In a world like this, where it was normal to die young or not live much past 40, it was truly shocking that someone lived to almost 100. Daenerys and Visenya were shocked to learn that they had another living relative, and one so old. When he heard what had happened to his family, he wanted to break his decades-old oath and get on a horse and wield a sword, and even though he was blind and old, he wanted to avenge everyone's death. Einar spoke with a sigh, feeling moved by a man who would give his life for his family. Daenerys' eyes filled with tears as she listened to Einar's words, and she truly felt that her family was united and strong. "I want to meet him," she muttered to herself. "You will see him." Einar smiled and replied by stroking her hair, trying to calm the girl down. The next word surprised the three women even more. Besides, he wasn't our only relative living near the wall. Brynden Rivers, one of the great bastards of Westeros and son of Aegon for the Unworthy, is also alive at nearly 120 years of age. The three women's mouths dropped open in shock at hearing the man's age. "Many relatives are still alive. I like a big family," Daenerys muttered to herself with a smile on her lips. The day after the family talk, in the city of Volantis, Einar wore a cloak to hide his appearance as he watched the city with curiosity. It was the first free city he had actually visited, in the city of Bravos. He didn't get to know the city, he just stayed on the boat with Belgeir. So, he was curious about Volantis. Behind Einar, not far from him, 5 red guards pretended to be patrolling the streets, but they were secretly protecting their master from other people. The reason Einar was in the city was simple. He saw an interesting scene in the future, a scene he wanted to see for himself. And if it really happened like the future he had predicted, he would have his first 2 generals from 2 future legions he would create. Along with these 2 legions, there would be 18 more legions, but he would create them later in life. Walking through the city, Einar couldn't help but notice that some of the customs of the Red Faith had been incorporated into the people and buildings around him, which didn't surprise him. Most people were slaves and wanted to be free. The Red Faith gave them that. In times of need, most people turned to God for help. Einar walked on. He visited the whole city, except behind the black walls. He didn't want to burn those people alive if they angered him. If there was a more selfish people in the world, it was the descendants of Valyria behind the black walls of Volantis. Suddenly, Einar's footsteps stopped, and he raised his head to look down the alley. A smile appeared on his lips and the Targaryen prince moved toward the alley. Strange sounds of fighting and growling could be heard coming from the alley. A battle was in progress. Entering the alley, what Einar saw made him realize once again the cruelty of this world. 2 teenagers, thin as sticks, could be seen at the end of the alley, cornered by equally hungry dogs. They were so thin, small, and dirty that he could count how many ribs each had. One of the teenagers had a piece of bone containing some meat in his hand, apparently the reason for the fight with the dogs to begin with. But it was the look in the eyes of these 2 teenagers that made Einar truly feel that this journey was worth his time. A look that, even in death, showed no fear, only regret for not continuing the fight for survival. The look in the eyes of the 2 teenagers made Einar's heart grow with admiration for them. He saw many different futures, brave men dying, heroic men dying, men full of honor dying. But if there was one thing they had in common, it was the look in their eyes as they faced imminent death. Even though they were men who would be remembered for their deeds, fear filled their gaze. However, the pair of teenagers in front of him, even in death, showed such a calm and cold look that it made him wonder if there was any emotion in these two teenagers. Pulling out two daggers, Einar threw both blades at the boys and waited idly for the scene to unfold. He didn't say anything or ask them for anything, he just waited in silence. The two teenagers were surprised to see the two daggers falling in front of them, but there was no hesitation in their actions. The desire for extreme survival made them act as fast and deadly as they could at that moment. However, the dogs weren't slow in their actions either. They lunged at the teenagers with a crazed, enraged look on their faces. An exchange of bites and stabs began in front of Einar, a brutal and cruel fight for survival. He watched it all in complete silence and with a coldness that could send shivers down a person's spine. Blood flew in the air as bites and scratches were exchanged for a meager piece of flesh no bigger than a palm. One of the teenagers, despite the bloody bite marks on his arms, with a crazed look on his face, managed to drive the blade into the dog's neck, which, with a sad, whimpering sound, stopped moving on top of the boy. The dog's hot, ferrous blood fell onto the boy's body as the dagger was removed from the dog's body. He threw the canid's body aside and quickly looked over to where his brother was desperately fighting two other dogs. Arg har. Without hesitation, the boy advanced on the dogs with a loud, intimidating shout. The boy, who looked older, was fighting two dogs. He had bite marks on his arms and chest. There was one in particular on his neck that showed he had almost died a few moments ago. However, the boy looked like a wolf, fending off the dog's bites using his own arm as a shield. He seemed to feel no pain as he attacked at the right moment. As a result, he managed to finish off one of the dogs, although he paid a high price, with a lot of his blood dripping from the horrible wounds on his body. Luckily for the boy, his younger brother had arrived and with a blow from behind, drove the blade into the dog's skull, which died almost instantly. But the younger brother wasn't happy, especially seeing the number of wounds on his older brother's body. Let's go to the Red Temple to see one of the Red Priestesses. The younger brother spoke quickly while breathing heavily. He tried to lift his brother's body, but it was no use. He didn't even have the strength to walk at the moment, let alone carry someone else. Titus. He looked at his younger brother, who was trying to lift him up to walk, and spoke in a dry, hoarse tone. I won't survive. Ignoring his brother's words, Titus screamed loudly and finally gathered the strength to stand up. But after taking 2 steps forward carrying his brother's body, he slipped and fell to the ground, breaking his nose in the process. Young Titus didn't care, and even though he was down, he dragged himself toward the exit of the alley. Even though the chances of not getting help weren't great, the slightest chance caused his body to produce large amounts of adrenaline. Your brother will die, and you with him. Titus didn't know who was speaking, but it was the most beautiful voice he had ever heard. The language the voice was speaking reminded him of his own, but much more sophisticated and elegant. Looking up, Titus, with his indomitable eyes, fixed on the purple eyes of the person in front of him. Einar couldn't help but smile at the sight of those eyes. It was like a calm fury of nature, deadly and silent with a strength and resilience that even he felt inferior to. Do you want to survive? Do you want to find a purpose? A purpose for which you feel honored and proud even if you have to die for it? Einar asked, crouching down as he touched the dirty ground with one knee. The only thing I ask in return is absolute loyalty. Will my brother live? Titus asked, feeling his vision begin to fail from the lack of blood in his body. Yes. He will be much more than just a man trying to survive, fighting for scraps in the streets day after day. Einar replied with a smile as he took the dagger from Titus' hand. I accept. There was no hesitation in his words, no trembling or fear, no emotion or anger at the fate that had been thrust upon him and his brother at that moment. Einar showed no hesitation either, slashing his own wrist with the dagger in one swift motion. Blood soon began to ooze from the wound. Einar began to mutter his first spell in the art of blood magic, which he had been taught by Queen Visenya. You will leave the life you know behind and be reborn from the cocoon of blood and fire. From my blood you will be reborn. Your lives will have no other purpose than to serve me with your body and soul. Even if one day you are unable to walk or die on the battlefield, You will still have fought in my name for all eternity. From my blood you will be reborn. You will be my steel and iron in the fight against the evil of humanity. From my blood you will be reborn. You will command my legions in my name. You will bring death and chaos to my enemies and peace and prosperity to mankind. Titus and Sigmund didn't know what was happening to them at that moment, but they both tasted blood in their mouths and heard every word he said as a deafening sound in their minds. In the end, their bodies were as hot as if they had been thrown into a forge, and they both lost consciousness, only his purple eyes deeply engraved in their souls for all eternity. Looking at the two teenagers in front of him, Einar smiled. Titus and Sigmund now looked completely different from the first time he had seen them. Both had grown 10 centimeters, and their bodies weren't so skinny, and muscular lines were evident on both young men's bodies. The scars on both of them remained, but in his eyes, they were memories that Titus and Sigmund would remember for a lifetime. Ser Willem and Bonero will train you both. Their orders are to be treated like mine. Don't hesitate and do them. Don't be lazy or you'll be flogged as punishment. Einar continued with a calm and regal expression, his eyes looking at the two teenagers. Other children and teenagers will be trained with you. They will be your brothers, and you have to avenge their deaths if they die in the future. Yes, Your Grace. The brothers spoke at the same time while their bodies seemed to exert a pressure on any normal person. Something that made Willem and Bonero look shocked. They had personally seen the transformation of the two brothers. They had grown, healed from mortal wounds, and become stronger. How could this not shock them? Titus and Sigmund were special. Einar used his own blood to perform blood magic and basically created the first superhumans. The teenagers didn't know it, but they were faster, stronger, and had reflexes that surpassed most of humanity. Einar wouldn't be surprised if his blood gave some special abilities to the brothers in front of him. After all, blood was anything but normal. What is the name of the army that Your Grace is creating? Ser Willem, wearing the white armor of the Kingsguard, asked with a respectful tone. When he learned that Einar was Rhaegar's son, he couldn't help but thank the gods for being benevolent towards House Targaryen, leaving a male descendant for the future. Sardaukar. Einar spoke the name without hesitation. It was the army loyal only to him, the king, and no one else. They would be his extremely deadly and absolutely loyal elite army. Einar turned to Bonero and asked with a glass of wine in his hand. He looked at the tattoo-covered man with a calm gaze. How are we doing as the regular army? The losses totaled around 5,000 men, many of whom were resurrected, but need to be trained again, due to the loss of memories and emotions, the after-effects of the resurrection. Bonero replied with a respectful tone as he bowed. Einar thought for a moment and spoke. The families of these dead soldiers should receive twice as much help and money. Their children can enter the Red Temple to learn to write and read, and if they wish, join the Red Legion. Although it doesn't sound like much of a reward, it was a great one for fallen soldiers or those with after effects. Learning to read and write might seem ordinary, but in a world where more than 90% of the population was illiterate, it was a reward that could change the fate of many families. I will do as ordered, Your Grace. Bonero responded to Einar's words with a gentle smile on his face. The Son of Light was what he had expected, not only a great man, but also a man who cared about his soldiers and their descendants. Einar said a few more things to everyone and left Bonero's office, walking towards his room. Behind him, for guards from the Red Legion always followed him. They all carried swords at their waists and followed him with cold, serious expressions. All four were soldiers who had died and returned from the dead. They had lost most of their emotions and memories, but they remembered their loyalty and religious devotion, which had become even more solid after dying and reviving. Arriving at his room, Einar was surprised for a moment to see his aunt on his bed reading a book with a concentrated look. However, it was her clothes that caught his attention, for instead of a dress, she was wearing clothes considered more masculine, worn by lords for riding. Her intention was obvious with those clothes. Hearing the door being opened, Daenerys raised her head and saw her nephew entering the room. She quickly put down her book and got out of bed, running towards him with an excited look on her face. Letting out a sigh, Einar knew she couldn't hide and flashed a gentle smile. I guess you're ready to fly with me in Caraxes? Absolutely yes. In front of him, Daenerys replied with a look of eagerness to finally fly on a dragon. Nodding his head, Enar smiled and walked towards the closet to change his clothes. When he opened the closet, he saw that all the clothes had only two colors, red or black, all with the House Targaryen crest on them. Enar chose his favorite color, red. Going behind a screen under Daenerys' disappointed eyes, Enar reappeared a few minutes later with his clothes already changed and holding a pair of leather gloves. Laughing at Daenerys' disappointed expression, Enar spoke in a gentle tone. "Come on, you look eager to fly on a dragon." The disappointment of not seeing her nephew change clothes vanished the moment Daenerys heard about flying on a dragon. She quickly came to his side and took his hand, dragging him forward, trying to speed up his steps. "Come on, nephew." Enar rolled his eyes, but understood the reason for her excitement. Like any Targaryen, the desire to fly on a dragon seemed to be ingrained in her blood. It was normal for Daenerys to show such emotion, something that although Rhaella and Visenya hid well, they also wanted to fly on a dragon. "You don't have to pull me," he said. Enar sighed and took the girl in his arms, which wasn't difficult. He estimated that Daenerys weighed no more than 50 kilos and perhaps even lighter. "You're small," Enar commented in an amused tone, making Daenerys pout, but she didn't deny his words. She really was small and perhaps wouldn't grow more than 3 to 5 centimeters in the future. "Don't you like small girls?" Daenerys asked in a seemingly casual tone, but Enar felt her body tense in his arms. He didn't need to be a genius to know her thoughts. "I don't care how small or tall you are, we'll walk the tortuous path ahead together." Enar replied in a gentle tone and felt her body relax again. Daenerys looked at him with a bright gaze and knew that with those words, he wasn't against their marriage, and that made her let out a sweet, pleasant laugh. Then, under Enar's surprised eyes, she approached him and kissed him on the lips in a quick, chaste kiss, quickly pulling his face away with an obvious shyness in her gaze. The dragon princess's cheeks took on a very obvious red hue given her pale skin. Enar rolled his eyes and quickly arrived in front of Caraxes. The crimson dragon was lying on the ground with his huge body looking like a small red hill. As far as he knew, Caraxes had eaten dozens of sheep before going to sleep again the night before. Noticing the arrival of his knight, Caraxes opened his eyes and his double eyelids blinked and his red eyes sharpened. Placing Daenerys on the ground, Enar put on his gloves and gestured for her to follow him. Daenerys saw his movements and imitated them, gradually climbing the iron net. As she climbed, she occasionally glanced at the dragon's face, seeing if it might be angry at her actions and devour her in one bite. To Daenerys' relief, she managed to climb onto the saddle, where Enar could be seen holding a leather belt connected to the saddle by 4 thick chains. Remember, small dragons can be ridden without a saddle, but adult dragons must always be ridden with saddles. Enar explained as he wrapped the belt around his and Daenerys' waists and pulled it tight. Daenerys nodded with a serious expression, listening to Enar's tips and mentally writing everything down so that she would never forget it when she had her own dragon. Suvgan Caraxes. Daenerys heard Enar speak in High Valyrian. Then, under her shocked eyes, Caraxes rose from the ground, towering to a simply incredible height. In the next instant, Daenerys understood why adult dragons should only be ridden with a saddle. As the dragon rose into the air, she felt her body being thrown backwards violently. If it hadn't been for the belt around her waist and the strong body behind her, she would have been thrown out of the saddle and probably died in the fall. The gigantic crimson dragon rose into the sky of Volantis, the creature's shadow looming below, covering a large part of the city, causing exclamations of shock and fear among the inhabitants of the First Daughter. Even half an hour after the dragon had disappeared from sight, people were still talking about it. At the same time, the rumors that the Son of Light of the Red Faith was in Volantis spread like fire burning a field of grass. The Crimson Dragon only confirmed the rumors, and this caused countless people to walk towards the Great Red Temple on pilgrimage. Looking down at the summer sea below her, the deep blue waters warmed by the sun, Daenerys opened her mouth without words to describe what she was feeling at that moment. Flying was everything she had hoped for, and more. The feeling of freedom was simply intoxicating. The loud, deafening sound of Caraxes' wings buzzed in her ear as her hair fluttered violently against the wind. "I'll show you something interesting." Daenerys heard her nephew's sweet whisper in her ear, and before she could say anything, he heard him shout, "Dracarys!" Daenerys' eyes widened at the scene that took place the next moment. Caraxes opened his mouth and a funnel of flames gushed into his mouth, and then the dragon simply stepped through the flames themselves with a loud, defiant roar. The dragon princess thought she would feel some pain, but apart from a slight increase in the surrounding temperature and the strong smell of sulfur in the air, she felt nothing, and even enjoyed the feeling of being surrounded by flames, even if it lasted less than 2 seconds. "Did you like it?" Enar asked with a smile, seeing the girl's startled expression. Daenerys' eyes lit up, and she forgot her earlier fear and nodded. "Again." She spoke with a tone full of emotion and happiness. Enar smiled and continued to order Caraxes to repeat the same act a few times before it stopped. The dragon flew dangerously close to the seawater, its tail hitting the sea, scattering the water everywhere before gaining altitude again. "I really want to hatch the dragon eggs soon," Daenerys commented, leaning on Enar's chest as she appreciated the feeling of peace and security that surrounded her. Feelings she thought she would never have in her life, especially after experiencing dozens of murders in her short 12-year life. "Remember our house motto, Dany," Enar commented, stroking his silky hair. He had no doubt that she was capable of hatching the 3 dragon eggs. "Blood and fire." Hearing his unconditional trust in her, Daenerys' lips curved into a happy, beautiful smile. However, his words reminded her of the dream she'd had. A look of determination and faith appeared in her eyes. She was a dragon, and a dragon isn't afraid of fire. Seeing the look in her eyes, Enar knew that his words made any doubt and indecision disappear from her mind. The future unfolded in his eyes, and he saw it, Daenerys naked, coming out of the flames with 3 dragons of different colors. The mother of dragons was about to be born in the near future. Enar was eager to see the birth of Daenerys as the mother of dragons. "Let's go back. Your mother must be worried." Enar spoke as he grabbed the saddle's handrests and tilted his body to the side, a movement that Caraxes followed and began to fly back to Volantis. Daenerys didn't want to go back at that moment, but knowing that Enar was right, she accepted, even though she wanted to fly for longer. An hour later, Daenerys saw Volantis approaching rapidly, and minutes later, she was already above the city. Looking down, she saw people exclaiming loudly and pointing at the gigantic crimson dragon. This brought a smile to her lips. She understood that Enar liked to see people's reaction to seeing Caraxes. She would do the same if she had a dragon. Daenerys felt a strong tremor as Caraxes landed on the ground, her body thrown forward and stopped by the belt that held her in place. Looking at the height she was at, she knew that if she fell, the chance of injury was quite high. Enar removed the belt from his and Daenerys' waists, freeing himself while Caraxes stayed close to the ground, allowing his rider to descend. Once on the ground, Enar raised his arms and Daenerys didn't hesitate, jumping off the dragon and being picked up in her arms by her nephew. "I see you enjoyed yourselves." Hearing the voice behind them, Enar and Daenerys saw Visenya looking at them with a bored expression. Daenerys flashed a big smile with her teeth showing and spoke animatedly. "I was the first to fly the dragon." Visenya rolled her eyes, but her gaze contained a touch of envy. However, she wouldn't fight with Daenerys over something like that. Looking at Enar, Visenya plastered a sweet smile on her lips and spoke in a gentle tone. "Lunch is served, nephew." Enar nodded and replied, "I'll go and have a bath and join you later." Stroking Daenerys' hair one last time, Enar left, leaving both sisters alone, watching his back in silence. Turning to Visenya, Daenerys flashed a smug smile and commented with a cheerful, mysterious tone, "You won't believe what he and I have done." Visenya gritted her teeth listening to her presumption. Daenerys really knew how to irritate her very easily, but in the end, curiosity won out in her mind. "What did you do?" "I kissed him." Raising her head like a proud peacock, Daenerys said, making Visenya show a stunned expression. Her sister had grown up on the adult ladder before her. Gritting her teeth, she glared fiercely at Daenerys. In terms of proactivity, her younger sister was actually better than her. Visenya was shy about bed matters and related things. Taking a deep breath, Visenya calmed the bubbling feelings in her chest, and ignoring the smug smile on her sister's lips, she left with slightly faster than normal steps. She didn't think she had any less charm than Daenerys. She was just too shy and gentle to care about being outdone by her younger sister. Daenerys' mood was in the clouds seeing Visenya's expression, Although she couldn't go to war, she could win another kind of war. Jumping up and down with joy, Daenerys followed her sister as she smiled a rather proud smile of her own. In the night, Daenerys was walking through the corridors of the Great Temple towards her nephew's room, going to say goodnight. However, her steps soon stopped. She quickly hid behind a pillar and spied Kinvara, the Reverend Mother, entering her nephew's room so late at night. A bad, bitter feeling rose in her chest. Daenerys knew it was jealousy talking. She didn't like the scenes she was imagining inside Enar's room at the moment. Turning around, Daenerys returned to the room she shared with her sister and mother, which had become routine for them in their years of exile. Entering the room, the dragon princess saw her mother combing her hair in front of a mirror and her older sister lying on the bed holding a book with a candle beside it to illuminate the pages. "Why did you come back so quickly, dear?" Riella asked curiously, watching her daughter's premature arrival. "I saw the Reverend Mother entering Enar's room." Sitting down on the bed, Daenerys replied in a slightly lower tone than usual. Riella and Visenya's movements stopped at her words. Riella smiled and went back to combing her hair as she answered her daughter. "She probably went to ask permission for something, dear. You don't have to worry so much." Although she said it herself, she didn't believe her own words one bit. What would a young man feel when he was in a room alone with a beautiful woman in the middle of the night? Daenerys' mood was improved by her mother's words. She looked at her older sister and spoke in a gentle tone. "If only sister had been more proactive, my sweet nephew wouldn't be seeking the warmth of another woman right now." Perhaps it was Riella's imagination, but she thought she heard an arrow strike her eldest daughter. Daenerys' intention was not to hurt Visenya with her words, but to encourage her sister to be braver and bolder. If she remained as timid as she was, it was possible that she herself would jump into Enar's bed to prevent other women from climbing into her nephew's bed. Visenya felt great shame seeing Daenerys and Riella's gazes looking at her with encouragement. "I'll do it," she murmured shyly, but the two women in the room heard her words and nodded, showing satisfied expressions. In Enar's room, Enar listened attentively to the report from the Emperor's daughters, the Red Faith Intelligence Organization. Word about him was spreading fast. It wouldn't be long before the whole of the known world knew about him and Caraxes. "I hope you get better, cousin. I want to fight with a powerful king, not a fat king." Enar muttered to himself. Westeros, land of the Crown King's Landing. 7th moon of the year 294 BC. Tyrion looked at his adorable nephew and niece with a smile. He still couldn't believe that these sweet children had emerged from the dark and evil hole that was his sister's womb. Their innocent, happy smiles diluted the uncomfortable feeling of contempt in the surrounding gazes. What are my lovely prince and princess doing? Perhaps rehearsing the legendary Dragon Knight rescuing the princess from the barbarians of the Vale? Tyrion asked, causing Myrcella and Tommen to look at him with surprised expressions. "Uncle." Both children ran and stood around him with expressions full of admiration. The girl and boy bore such a strong resemblance to Cersei and Jaime that Tyrion sometimes thought they were both Jaime's son and daughter. But that was impossible, right? The consequences of such thoughts were not simply something trivial, but a real crisis and a possible war capable of devastating the continent once again. "Uncle, I'm bigger than you," Myrcella said with a cute, graceful laugh, using her hand to measure the height between her and Tyrion. If this joke had been made by anyone else, Tyrion would have thought it was an insult directed at him, but not coming from his innocent and sweet niece. "That's incredible. Myrcella is getting more and more graceful and beautiful with time." He spoke with a quizzical expression, drawing laughter from the two children. However, Myrcella's next question made his smile stiffen for a moment. "Uncle, am I pretty enough for Prince Enar, riding his dragon Caraxes, to come and ask my father for my hand? He was so heroic saving his family from the barbarians of Essos." She spoke with such an innocent and dreamy expression that she stopped the cruel words from leaving Tyrion's lips. Proposing? He would find it kind enough if Prince Enar didn't incinerate them all in seconds. He would certainly do the same if he had a dragon capable of burning tens of thousands of people alive. Who wouldn't want a beautiful, sweet princess, dear Myrcella? Tyrion certainly couldn't say what he was thinking and smiled gently at the girl, who kept a dreamy smile on her lips, as if delighted at the idea of being the wife of someone so important. Tyrion couldn't help but think of the rumors that had been circulating around Westeros for a month. The existence of Aenar Targaryen was like a powerful punch to the stomachs of the great houses. And the blow was even more devastating when the existence of the dragon called Caraxes was revealed. Obviously, such rumors, at first, were considered just nonsense and madness coming from Essos. However, as more ships arrived from the continent carrying the same story, the rumor ceased to be just a rumor. Within a month, it became a fact that everyone had to accept with a bitter taste, especially the great houses that had taken part in the rebellion 12 years ago. Tyrion saw countless houses moving into the shadows with the news, and had no doubt that the pretender to the Iron Throne from across the sea had many supporters in Westeros. Honestly, he didn't blame these noble houses. Robert I Baratheon's reign had been mediocre to say the least. Worst of all, the Targaryen prince, in addition to owning a full-grown dragon, commanded an army of almost 40,000 men. Add that to the fleet in Volantis and the internal problems of the Seven Kingdoms, and it was clear that they had a big problem on their hands. Tyrion said goodbye to his niece and nephew as he listened to them talk, innocently excited, about the dragon that could cover a city like Volantis with the shadow of its wings. The little lion of House Lannister was neither as optimistic nor as innocent as his nephews. He knew very well what was coming: blood and fire. Their blood and the fire of House Targaryen. Tyrion walked to the small council chamber. He ignored the Kingsguard and opened the doors, surprised by the sight before him. His father, Tywin Lannister, Cersei Lannister, Jon Arryn, Renly Baratheon, Stannis Baratheon, Varys, Littlefinger and several others were present. The atmosphere was stifling, to say the least. It was the first time Tyrion had seen his father with such an expression. Serious, dignified, and full of a majesty that made him stand out more than Robert I Baratheon himself, who filled the seat with his huge fat body. All eyes turned to Tyrion for a moment, but soon focused back on Varys. "Your information, eunuch?" Robert asked. His voice was calm, but it hid a fury that everyone noticed, and no one dared to comment on. Aenar Targaryen, first of his name, Knight of Caraxes, King of the Undulls, the Roynars and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm, Father of Dragons, Son of the Light of Volantis, the King who was promised. The long list of titles came out of the eunuch's fat lips, making everyone serious. Apart from the obvious ones, related to the Iron Throne, the rest was what really worried everyone. Varys continued to keep the same smile on his lips and the enigmatic look in his eyes. The size of the crimson dragon called Caraxes is immense, unmistakably an adult and powerful dragon in its prime. According to the spies, when the dragon flies above Volantis, the sky darkens under the shadow of its wings. Its fire is as red as blood and capable of melting rock into lava. The tense atmosphere was abruptly broken by a female voice echoing in the hall. "It's just a dragon. We have the armies of the Seven Kingdoms, 200,000 men." Tyrion was speechless at the level of intelligence demonstrated by his sister's words. Although he knew that intelligence had never been her strong point, this level of stupidity was truly impressive. Even a blind man could see that they were completely dead if Prince Targaryen decided to mount his dragon and reduce the Red Keep to ashes. Slap sound. A loud, sharp slap echoed through the small council chamber. "Shut up, woman. Nobody asked you anything." Robert's voice was terribly cold and slightly frightening. His deep blue eyes seemed to blaze with an uncommon fury. Tyrion admitted to himself. He had enjoyed seeing Cersei slapped. The expression of shock and indignation on his sister's face was simply spectacular. In another, more appropriate moment, he would even have paid for a prostitute and a jug of wine for Robert as thanks. Tywin, under normal circumstances, would have been angered by such an act. But in this case, he thought it was a good slap. He still found it hard to believe that something so stupid had come out of his own balls and his beloved wife's womb. House Lannister had an army of 50,000 men, comparable in numbers to the Dothraki, but even so, the nomadic warriors hadn't lasted more than 15 minutes against a dragon. He really wanted to understand how his daughter could consider Myr a monster capable of incinerating an entire army equivalent to House Lannister in a matter of minutes. Seeing that her father did absolutely nothing while she was humiliated in front of the entire court, Cersei suppressed the resentment and hatred inside her, pulling herself together with a beautiful smile on her lips. but her hands clenched in her lap made it clear that she was trying her best not to say anything rash. "In answer to the queen, it's no mere dragon," Varys said in a respectful tone. But his words only made the atmosphere even heavier. "It's a full-grown dragon that burned more than 40,000 men and horses alive in less than 15 minutes. What was the concept of burning 40,000 people in less than 15 minutes? If they followed that logic, an army of 100,000 men would be completely destroyed in half an hour. And that was absolutely terrifying. Robert, however, didn't seem to have heard any of this. He looked at the eunuch and asked, "Who are his parents?" Varys held the king's gaze, restraining himself as much as possible, and then answered, bowing slightly. According to himself, Prince of Dragonstone, Rhaegar of Targaryen and Lady Lyanna of House Stark. Crash! The chair Robert was sitting on flew against the wall. Thrown by the king himself, in front of everyone's astonished gazes. No one had ever imagined that he could still be so strong and surprisingly fast. The fruit of a grape. Robert's roar echoed through the small council chamber. "I'll kill him like I killed his bloody father." Tyrion had never heard a roar like that. It wasn't just a cry of rage, but the roar of a wounded animal, consumed by hatred. The sound sent shivers through his body. At that moment, Robert the First Baratheon did indeed sound like a king. "Calm down, Robert. We need to keep a cool head to deal with what's coming." Jon Arryn approached the king quickly, his presence and words having an immediate effect. Robert's mood began to stabilize, and he stopped wheezing with rage. This eased, if only slightly, the suffocating tension that hung over the small council chamber. Tywin, impassive, turned to Pycelle and asked in a regal tone, "What are the chances of us getting a clear shot, as Dorne has in the past?" Pycelle, still pretending to be a frail and feeble old man, replied in his usual trembling voice, "The Order has carried out some experiments. They were conducted about 80 years after the event, launching 10,000 scorpions at a target fixed 1,000 meters high and motionless. In the end, none of them hit the target." No one questioned why the Order of the Maesters conducted such suspicious experiments just when House Targaryen was still at its peak. But the numbers made one thing clear: Dorne had been incredibly lucky to land that fatal shot on a dragon. Note, this is one of the reasons why I find Rhaegal's death completely unrealistic and stupid. Precision rifle bullets already lose their effectiveness at great distances, let alone a giant medieval beast. Rhaegal's death was clearly inserted just to justify Dany burning down King's Landing. This means that even if we fill the walls with scorpions, the chances of killing a dragon are still extremely low. Renly Baratheon broke the silence with a comment full of concern. The fear in his eyes was evident, and understandable. After all, House Baratheon had been the main driving force behind the fall of the Targaryens. If there was one family that would be reduced to ashes first, it was his. We're lucky the Targaryen prince doesn't have his grandfather's madness. Tyrion swirled the wine in his goblet before taking a sip and continuing. If it were the other way around, the Red Keep would have become the second Harrenhal by now. Although Tywin Lannister despised his youngest son, he couldn't help but agree with that statement. The thought of Aerys with a dragon sent shivers down his spine. "If I may say so," Tyrion continued, setting his goblet down on the table, "we need to strengthen the ties between House Baratheon and the great houses." Many nodded immediately. There was no alternative. This was the most essential step at that moment. No one doubted that, at this very moment, many noble houses were preparing to fight the Baratheons alongside Prince Targaryen. The threat of destruction was enough to bend even the proudest. For many, the return of the dragons was divine punishment for Robert Baratheon killing his own kin. Murderers of kin must always receive punishment from the gods. Marrying Prince Joffrey to Lady Margaery Tyrell could bring House Tyrell to the side of the crown. Peter, known as Littlefinger, said with a smile on his lips, his eyes narrowing into a thoughtful look, "Tyrell." Tyrion let out a short but humorless laugh. "They'll be the first to ally themselves with Prince Targaryen. Add to that the hatred of House Martell, and we have two great houses as enemies." The dwarf took a sip of wine, eyeing Littlefinger suspiciously. There had always been something about him that made it impossible to trust him completely. 2 great houses, Tyrion continued, with armies that together amount to hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Add to that Prince Targaryen's 40,000 men and a dragon capable of incinerating entire armies in minutes. Not to mention that the Tyrells are the kingdom's granary, with plenty of food to sustain their troops for as long as they want. We could invite them to King's Landing and take them hostage. Cersei spoke casually, as if she had solved the problem with a snap of her fingers. The silence that followed was almost comical. Everyone in the room exchanged glances before simply ignoring her suggestion. If something like this was so easy, other great houses would have been brought down long ago with this cheap trick. The break in the silence came from Tywin, who until then had watched everything without saying a word. I will hire assassins from the House of Black and White in Bravos. This time, the silence that spread through the small council chamber was different. Everyone knew what that meant. Hiring an assassin of that order was already absurdly expensive. Hiring one to kill a dragonlord was even more expensive. Hiring one to kill a dragonlord in a city protected by religious and political fanatics was beyond any imaginable price. And only 2 people in that room had enough wealth to afford such a thing. Tywin Lannister and Littlefinger. The latter, thanks to years of fraud and embezzlement in the kingdom's finances, had amassed a fortune that could rival that of a great house. But nobody knew about it, and they were unlikely to in the future. Robert, who until then had listened to everything in silence, looked around the table. The only ones with calm expressions were Tywin, Stannis, and the imp. The rest showed visible concern. The king then leaned back, wiped the alcohol stains from the corner of his mouth, and said in his deep voice, "If he hasn't come to us, it means he wants to reconquer Westeros. That means he doesn't want to rule Ashes, which is good news." Robert then slammed his hand down hard on the table, his blue gaze filled with restrained fury. "He will come to avenge his grapist father. And I will kill him, just as I killed his damned father." The strong, powerful man who hadn't been seen since the Greyjoy Rebellion had reappeared more imposing than ever, perhaps even more so than in the war 12 years ago. Even though he was an irresponsible king, Robert knew he had to secure the throne for his son. He had no doubt that that incestuous bastard would kill everyone related to him without any hesitation. Ensuring his children's safety was his priority, even if it meant becoming dragon food. "Littlefinger, I don't care how. Get some money and help Lord Tywin pay off the assassins. If that fails, we'll prepare for war." Robert's order echoed with a firm and powerful tone, surprising everyone in the room. "Yes, Your Grace." Littlefinger smiled, trying hard to be serious, but deep down, he could already see the opportunities looming before him. Jon Arryn sighed. How he wished this Robert had been awake all the time. But he knew that this moment of lucidity would be fleeting. His eyes turned to the Queen, who remained impassive, her gaze deep and calculating. The investigations of the last few months had revealed frightening truths that would have terrible consequences for the whole of Westeros. Now, with Prince Targaryen on the other side of the sea, the situation was taking an even darker turn. "Eunuch, send a message to Ned explaining everything." Robert turned to Varys, his voice filled with authority. "I'll do as you say, Your Grace." The eunuch's gentle smile didn't convince Tyrion for a second. The dwarf watched in silence as the most powerful men in the Seven Kingdoms were wary of a young man who hadn't even turned 13. That said a lot about the world they lived in. Perhaps it was time to run far away. The scales of war were definitely not tipping in favor of the Lannisters or the Baratheons. Both seemed destined to burn under the flames of a dragon. He drank the rest of his wine, and as he lowered the goblet, he felt a piercing gaze upon him. His father. Tywin Lannister's cold gaze sent a shiver down his spine. "Your Grace." His father's voice sounded exactly as Tyrion had feared. Robert raised an eyebrow, confused. "To ensure that our enemy sponsors his own war, we need the Iron Bank not to support Prince Targaryen. Or, at the very least, to remain neutral." Tywin's voice was icy, impassive. Tyrion immediately understood. If the Iron Bank chose sides, it could define the war before it even began. Robert frowned. He didn't like to think about these things, but he knew Tywin was right. "Who do you suggest goes to Bravos?" Tywin didn't hesitate. Although my son is physically unfit, his intelligence is unquestionable. At any other time, Tyrion would have been thrilled to hear his father acknowledge his intelligence. Now, all he felt was a shiver of dread. Bravos. The continent of Essos was undoubtedly the most dangerous place in the world at the moment. Even the free cities, powerful as they were, didn't dare raise their voices when a dragonlord from Valyria landed in their harbors with a dragon. Even less so now that all the free cities' old anti-dragon weapons had been corroded by time. If the information that Tyrion Lannister was in Essos leaked out, his fate would be sealed. Good move, father. You don't have the guts to kill me, so you want others to do it for you. Tyrion smiled. But inside, he felt the pain of a pawn about to be sacrificed on the board of a much bigger game. The Reach, High Garden. Marjorie stood in a corner, watching her parents, siblings and grandmother arguing with heated and somewhat rude words, mainly from her grandmother, Olenna. The girl could feel the tense atmosphere in the air. Mace Tyrell, Lord of High Garden, Lord Paramount of the Mandor, Defender of the Marches, High Marshal of the Reach, Warden of the South and head of House Tyrell, looked at his mother and asked with a slightly apprehensive tone, "What are we going to do, mother?" Olenna looked at her cowardly son and was still amazed that such a stupid creature had come out of her womb. Letting out a weary sigh, she stared at him with a touch of coldness that made the Guardian of the South wince. "Stop acting like a child. You're the freaking Guardian of the South. Act like it, you big stupid green pig." Mace just ducked his head and cringed like a little boy at his mother's words, something his wife, Allery Hightower, found amusing. She laughed and held her husband's arm, gently comforting him. "A raven has arrived from King's Landing. The king has invited House Tyrell to a tournament to commemorate Prince Joffrey's name day." With his wife's help, Mace spoke in an excited tone. In his eyes, this was House Tyrell's chance to get engaged to the Crown Prince of the Iron Throne. Looking at the growing ambition in her son's eyes, Olenna let out another weary, helpless sigh. "You stupid son, have you forgotten the news we received a week ago? How can you even consider going to King's Landing right now?" She spoke with a scolding tone, her face showing irritation at her son's thoughts. She couldn't understand why he had such great ambition while being mediocre in every sense of the word. But they're just rumors. Mace retorted, dissatisfied with his mother's hesitation. His reply was met with Olenna's cane striking his body repeatedly. The old woman was livid with rage at that moment. "Rumors? You say that hundreds of the same rumors are just damn rumors." Olenna shouted, enraged. She really wanted to die at that moment, so that she wouldn't have to stress about every silly thing her son said. Unfortunately, she had to stay alive, or her stupid son would destroy House Tyrell in less than 10 years. "Sorry, mother. I'm not going to answer you anymore. Just stop hitting me." Mace begged as he shielded his face with his fat arms. Stopping beating her son when she heard his pleas, Olenna turned her gaze to her eldest grandson, Willis, and asked in a gentle tone, "What do you think, Willis?" "Reinforcing the border in the west and preparing for war." Willis didn't hesitate to answer. His words brought a smile to Olenna's flabby lips. If Mace had at least 10% of his grandson's intelligence and wit, she wouldn't be so worried. "Why?" she continued. "Because with the news of Prince Targaryen and his dragon, along with his army of fanatics, it's only a matter of time before they come to Westeros. Anyone with a modicum of discernment knows that alliances must be formed now to resist the reconquest of the Targaryen dynasty." Willis replied calmly and gently. "Tywin Lannister is a cruel and merciless man. Anyone who doesn't side with him will be exterminated." Finished the High Garden heir. Turning to Mace, Olenna couldn't help but speak sarcastically. "If you had 10% of Willis' intelligence, I could die in peace, knowing that House Tyrell would survive longer." Mace bowed his head like a scolded child, which, strange as it was, eased the tension in the hall a little. "You're right, Willis. The old lion is merciless. He'll slit our necks the moment we turn our backs on him." Olenna spoke calmly before continuing, "Unlike other great houses, we fought for House Targaryen in the rebellion 12 years ago. If Prince Targaryen is at all intelligent, he will know that an alliance with House Tyrell is more profitable and reliable than with other great houses." She concluded firmly, We just need to wait and prepare to bend the knee at the right moment. We will remain the guardians of the South. Highgarden will not become another Harrenhal while I am alive. Can we trust this Prince Targaryen, Mother? Wouldn't it be better to marry Marjorie off to Prince Joffrey? Mace questioned, feeling that, as Lord of Highgarden, he had the right to have his say. You fool. Olenna sighed, exasperated. House Baratheon looks strong, but it's not. It's in debt, practically bankrupt, owing millions to the Iron Bank and to us. Dorne will attack the Lannisters at the slightest opportunity. The Vale is powerful, but sparsely populated. House Tully is unable to control its vassals and is weakened. The North is strong, but difficult to rally quickly. My spies in King's Landing have already told me that Joffrey is madder than Aerys and crueler than Maegor. Tommen is a naive child and too young to rule anything. Stannis is the heir presumptive, but nobody likes him. Renly is even worse. A pillow biter can't be king. 5 options for the Iron Throne, and all are unfit. That means that if a certain mad prince dies, House Baratheon will go to war for the succession. Westeros needs just one spark for the flames of war to consume the continent once again. And that spark is Enar Targaryen and his dragon, who burned 40,000 men alive in less than 15 bloody minutes. Olenna concluded, sitting back in her chair with a serene expression. Olenna's words made Willis's eyes widen. For him, his grandmother's words meant only one thing. Prince Joffrey would die at any moment. Who will kill Prince Baratheon? Willis asked in disbelief. Although, as his mother had said, House Baratheon was not at its peak, it was still the royal house of Westeros. Many respected it and had heeded Robert Baratheon's call. Olenna rolled her eyes, her lips curving into a mischievous smile. I'm not saying that the little lion will die, but his death could be very convenient for many ambitious people. Her smile sent a shiver through everyone in the room, including Marjorie. No one doubted what would happen. The woman in front of them had earned the title of Queen of Thorns not only for her sharp tongue, but also for her ruthless intelligence. What are we going to do, Mother? What if Robert calls up his banners and marches into the Reach? Mace asked cautiously. Even if Reach had vast resources and a large army, Robert was still king. He could summon hundreds of thousands of soldiers. If they attack, burn all the crops and let the pigs devour each other. Olenna said, cold and indifferent to the death of millions with her words. The Reach was the granary of the 7 kingdoms. They sold food at low prices to all the other territories. If the crops were burned, famine would spread across Westeros at alarming levels. Only those with fertile land could survive. The North, for example, would be one of the worst affected. Even with Reach's help, they were already struggling to feed their population. Without this help, the situation would become untenable. Olenna's strategy was clear, a cruel sacrifice to further weaken her enemies. She was willing to lose an arm if it meant cutting off both of her opponent's arms and legs. Willis looked at his grandmother with admiration. Perhaps because he was young, he didn't yet have the same determination to make such a drastic decision. He could follow this strategy, but he would hesitate. He would never have the same coolness as Olenna. Mace, on the other hand, shook his head repeatedly in denial. He couldn't even conceive of such a proposal. How much gold would House Tyrell lose by burning its crops? The number of golden dragons that would no longer enter their coffers was something he didn't even want to think about. Watching her son shake his head and mutter to himself, Olenna didn't need to be a seer to understand his thoughts. It left her speechless. Was Mace really her son? Perhaps she had drunk too much and slept with her sister's husband. Wait, she really had stolen her sister's husband and married him. Putting these thoughts aside, Olenna smiled mischievously and muttered to herself, I'm really curious to see what happens to King's Landing if we stop supplying the city with food. Will they devour each other like starving pigs behind the walls? Dorne, Sunspear. Old Palace. Dam burning 40,000 men in less than 15 minutes is insane. Obara, Oberyn's eldest bastard daughter and leader of the Sand Snakes, spoke. She was tall and had a strong body. Her voice was thick, slightly effeminate, not at all like that of a woman. Be more polite in your words, sister. Nymeria, the second eldest daughter, replied with an elegant smile on her red lips. Although she looked like a virtuous lady from a noble house, you never knew if she was hiding a dagger in her hands until it was too late. Don't fight, my ears are calloused from all your arguments on this trip. Tyene, the third daughter of the Serpent of Dorn, spoke in a sweet, silky voice. Small and delicate, with blonde hair and bright blue eyes, her appearance was deceiving about her skill with poisons. Oberyn's third daughter was as deadly as her sisters. Her delicacy perfectly concealed her mastery of poisons, which she manipulated with lethal skill. Stop arguing, my father is calling us all. Arianne, wearing a flowing red silk dress, spoke with a sensual tone as she walked gracefully towards the dining hall. Obara and Nymeria looked at each other and snorted at the same time. Both followed behind Arianne with quick steps. Letting out a tired sigh, Tyene followed the group with her small, graceful steps. When Arianne entered the hall, the first person she saw was her cousin, Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, who was hiding in Dorne under the alias Rhaena Sand. The girl had grown a lot in the last year and a half, taller, more voluptuous in the right places, and just as deadly, as far as Arianne could tell from the fight between her and her uncle Oberyn. Another person present was the Prince of Dorne himself, her father, Doran Martell. Although he maintained his usual calm and deep expression, Arianne noticed a slight relaxation between his eyebrows. He was in a great mood, and Arianne understood why. Prince Targaryen was more remarkable than anyone expected. Even she thought the young prince had stepped straight out of one of the stories from the Age of Heroes. After all, traveling to another continent at the age of 12 to protect his family and burn 40,000 men was something worthy of being written down in the annals of history. How could anyone not admire a person capable of such a feat? However, knowing Prince Targaryen's secret identity, Arianne couldn't help but be surprised that such a powerful and honorable young man had grown up in the inhospitable lands of the north as a mere bastard. Honestly, she thanked the gods that Enar had been raised by Eddard Stark. If he had grown up resentful and angry at the world, like most of the bastards in Westeros, she could imagine the catastrophe that would have occurred. "Father, did you request my presence?" Arianne asked with a seductive smile on her lips. "You and Oberyn will meet Prince Enar and attend his coronation in Volantis. Oberyn will act as the prince's general and advisor. As for you, you will act as Queen Riella's handmaid until the prince marries his wife." Doran spoke in a calm tone, remembering the raven he had received from the queen. Riella's intentions were obvious. She wanted to know which side Dorne was on and whether they would fight alongside House Targaryen. At the same time, Oberyn and Arianne would serve as hostages to prevent House Martell from betraying the Targaryens. Doran couldn't help noticing that the exile in Essos had really sharpened the queen's political sense and made her extremely wary of betrayal. Which he understood perfectly. After all, House Targaryen collapsed under the weight of conspiracies and betrayals. Arianne's smile remained the same, but there was a deep bitterness hidden in her gaze. Handmaid? Have you ever seen the heiress of a kingdom become a handmaid? In her eyes, Doran was pushing her away from the throne of Dorne to favor Quentyn. "Father, you'll regret taking me away from what is rightfully mine. I'll watch with pleasure as you see me take what belongs to me with violence and force." Arianne thought, clenching her fists. Why was Arianne still pure and virgin, even with all the temptations of sex? The reason was right in front of her. Her father didn't want to let her inherit the throne of Dorne. If Doran didn't want to give her the Sun Throne, then she would take it by force, even if it meant becoming the secret lover of Prince Targaryen from across the sea. Arianne knew how to use her natural advantages, and she would use them to get what she wanted. Knowing exactly how to win a man's favor, she was confident that she could make Prince Enar accept her. Rhaenys didn't know that her cousin had been planning to seduce her brother for years, ever since she realized that Doran had no intention of passing the Sun Throne on to her. At that moment, however, Rhaenys was happy and full of joy. Unlike Oberyn and Arianne, she would go straight north to find Moonfire and then fly to Volantis to find her family. How could she not be happy? Her family would finally be reunited after decades of separation, blood, sweat, and pain. "Father, I heard that the new Sword of the Morning is coming to Sunspear." Arianne asked, causing all eyes to turn to Doran. The Lord of Dorne nodded and spoke in a voice full of admiration. Leda Dane, daughter of Ashera Dane, defeated 20 men in battle and became worthy to wield Dawn, becoming the new sword of the morning. Note: OC character inspired by Needle Knight Leda from Elden Ring. Even his brother, a great warrior, couldn't claim to have fought 20 men and come out of such a battle unscathed. But Leda did it and killed them all without suffering a scratch. Sighs of admiration echoed around them. The sand snakes were impressed to hear the Lord of Dorne's words. What has she come to do in Sunspear? Arianne asked curiously. It was very rare for a Sword of the Morning to leave Starfall, and when they did, it was usually to challenge great swordsmen and renowned warriors. She's going with you and Oberyn to Essos. She wants to serve as a Kingsguard, just as her uncle served Prince Rhaegar. Doran replied without hesitation. He remembered the raven sent by Ashera Dane, in which the woman explained her daughter's purpose. Will all the Swords of the Morning become members of the Royal Guard in the future? Tyene commented in an amused tone, provoking laughter that was joined by that of her sisters. But will the prince accept a woman into the Royal Guard? There have never been any in the Great Order of Knights of the Royal Guard. Nymeria asked, looking curiously at Rhaenys, the only person present who knew Prince Targaryen's mindset, despite never having met him in person. My brother doesn't care what someone has between their legs. If the person is useful, even a blind man can occupy the position of Master of Whispers. Rhaenys shrugged and replied with a touch of amusement. Besides, the Royal Guard was created by Queen Visenya. Arianne, in particular, was pleased to hear those words. The more open-minded Prince Targaryen, her future man, could make his plans to control Dorne much easier. Everyone nodded, but began to form a clearer picture of the mysterious Prince Targaryen. Even though he was young, he didn't seem inexperienced, but rather mature and wise beyond his years. Rhaenys, for her part, was well aware of why her brother was so mature. He carried the weight of leading humanity forward, his prophetic visions and the future wars that would determine whether humanity would continue or perish. As they discussed Prince Targaryen, the doors opened and Oberyn entered the hall with his wife, Illyria Sand. They walked arm in arm, their hair slightly mussed and the sweat still visible on their faces, causing laughter in the dining hall. We seem to have gotten in the way of something important, Father. Arianne commented in a gracious, amused tone. Doran just snorted, not bothering to interrupt his younger brother's pleasure time. He still remembered the words Oberyn had said a few days ago. I assume the preparations are ready. You will leave immediately for Volantis. We don't want to miss Prince Targaryen's coronation. Oberyn sighed as he saw the implacable look on his brother's face. Doran was especially vindictive when he wanted to be. He had only joked that his brother could no longer sleep with a woman, and because of those words, now he barely had time to rest or even stand still for a moment. Yes, my brother. Oberyn replied with a faintly sad and despondent tone, causing the laughter to grow even louder. Seeing the gigantic titan of Braavos getting closer and closer, Tyrion felt completely insignificant, even more so than he usually did on a daily basis. Note: I had to make the joke, I couldn't help myself. Tyrion looked around, observing the ship he was on. As he represented a king, naturally the ship couldn't look sloppy. He was traveling on a new ship that had never touched the sea. Curiously, the ship's name was the Purity of the Princess. She's no longer a virgin. Tyrion joked in an amused tone, reflecting on the ship's name. However, as he looked at the guards following him, he couldn't help but let out a sigh. They were only young and immature. They had probably never seen blood in their lives. The little lion of House Lannister could imagine that, in battle, these young men wouldn't last more than a few minutes against experienced warriors. Each of them wore arrogant expressions, trying to appear calm in the face of the majestic and magnificent city they were approaching. However, as they approached the city, Tyrion felt that he was getting close to a huge monster, ready to devour him at any moment. If he wasn't careful, Braavos might become his tomb, something his father certainly expected. After all, if he died serving the realm, he would die an honorable death and finally become worthy in the eyes of all, no longer a stain on the glorious reputation of House Lannister. May the Seven help me. I still want to go back to King's Landing and visit all the brothels in that shit-stinking city at least once more in my life. Tyrion muttered to himself, preferring to be in the warm, soft arms of the bitches of King's Landing than in that city that could become his tomb. Letting out a sigh, Tyrion watched as the ship docked at the port of Chequy, where customs officers were already prepared to inspect the vessel on the orders of the Sea Lord of Braavos. In the eyes of the people, the Titan of Braavos was a marvel, but for Tyrion, the true splendor of that city lay in the Braavos arsenal. Their war galleys could be built in a single day, a true masterpiece of Braavosi engineering. Tyrion straightened his golden clothes and flashed his best smile, although for many it wasn't a pretty one. Hoger, wearing typical Braavos garb, climbed aboard, surrounded by guards carrying fine swords. His eyes quickly scanned the ship before settling on its probable owner. A dwarf. A dwarf dressed in expensive clothes, bearing the crest of a golden lion. Tyrion Lannister, the son of the Golden Lion of the Rock. Hoger came to the conclusion of Tyrion's identity in an instant. As he gestured for the guards to begin their inspection of the ship, Hoger approached Tyrion and asked directly the purpose of his visit. "Why are you traveling to the city of Braavos?" "The Iron Bank." Tyrion answered without any hesitation. Hoger gave Tyrion a deep look and spoke in a casual tone. "If you and your men break the laws of Braavos, you'll be thrown into the dungeons, and your father will have to pay a lot of gold to get you out. It's more likely that he'll leave me to rot in the dungeons and simply forget I exist." Tyrion replied in an amused tone. Although it sounded like a joke, it was very possible that it would happen. His father would probably announce that he had died on the journey to Braavos. Hoger stared at the imp for a moment, without replying. In silence, he waited for the guards to return from their inspection, which took no more than 20 minutes. When one of the guards nodded, indicating that there was nothing wrong with the boat, Hoger turned his gaze to the dwarf and said, "Be careful what you do in Braavos." Having said that, he set off with the guards, leaving Tyrion alone again. "Prepare to leave." Tyrion ordered his own guards in a calm tone. As Tyrion stepped off the boat, he saw a crowd in front of him and couldn't help thinking that it was going to be a long day. As he made his way through the crowd, surrounded by his guards, he began to notice something strange. People were bumping into him more than usual. Looking around, his expression changed dramatically. His guards were gone. He was alone. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in the back of his head. His vision darkened and he fell unconscious. Before he completely lost consciousness, he felt the hot, dirty ground against his face as feet trampled over him. In his last remnants of consciousness, a single thought crossed his mind. "I'm dead. Tisha, my wife. I miss you so much." Tyrion awoke to the strong smell of musty wood. Opening his eyes with difficulty, he found himself in a suspicious cellar, impregnated with a strong smell of fish. Looking around, he couldn't help thinking he was in the house of a fisherman or a fishmonger. However, in the next second, he hissed in pain as he felt a throbbing blow to the back of his head. He tried to bring his hand to the spot, but realized that his wrists were bound. Struggling to move, he finally managed to sit up and take a closer look at his surroundings. What he saw made him breathe a sigh of relief. As long as he was alive, it meant that his kidnappers wanted something from him. Whether it was gold or anything else, he didn't care, as long as he could get back to Westeros. Suddenly, he heard heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. Soon, he saw a face he could never have expected in his entire life. "Is that Barristan?" Tyrion asked, his voice filled with genuine confusion and disbelief. Yes, standing before him was none other than Ser Barristan Selmy the Bold, a celebrated hero of the Kingsguard, from the time when these knights were still considered the strongest in the Seven Kingdoms. "You seem to have woken up, Lord Tyrion," Barristan said, crouching down in front of the dwarf and helping him to drink water from a wooden bowl. Tyrion drank desperately, feeling refreshed as he pushed the bowl away. Then, with a puzzled tone, he commented, "I must say I'm surprised, sir. I thought you were at Prince Targaryen's side at the moment." Yes, Barristan had fled King's Landing in the first week of the rumors about Prince Targaryen. His departure caused shock and surprise, especially among the Kingsguard, who had lost their Lord Commander. "I wanted to, but I couldn't go to my future king empty-handed," Barristan replied, dipping a piece of hard bread into the water and feeding it to Tyrion with a deep, serious look. Tyrion ate the bread without hesitation, immediately understanding the old knight's intentions. You want to use me as a trophy for Prince Enar, perhaps to seek forgiveness for your sins and once again serve House Targaryen. Barristan didn't deny it. He just nodded slightly and replied, "You're right about forgiveness. But if he so wishes, I will die anyway." His tone was calm, as if death were nothing more than a trivial possibility. Tyrion arched an eyebrow, trying to change his mind. "Do you realize that your chances of dying are high? You let his father perish at Robert's hands. Queen Riella will demand your head for that. So I will die without fear." Barristan replied, serene, as if he had accepted his fate long ago. "If death comes at the hands of the son of the one I should have protected, my sins and my oath will be redeemed at last." The old knight's blue eyes reflected an acceptance so profound that it shocked Tyrion. For the first time, he felt disgusted by Barristan Selmy's title daring. That man could die with honor, a quick and clean death. But he, Tyrion Lannister, would die slowly and painfully. Of that he had no doubt. Queen Riella would not hesitate to tear him apart for all the pain House Lannister had inflicted on House Targaryen. Especially because of the deaths of Queen Elia and her children, Prince Aegon and Princess Rhaenys. "Father, you really killed me," Tyrion thought, letting out a bitter, helpless laugh. Barristan, satisfied that he had given Tywin's son food and water, stood up and declared as calmly as ever, "We'll be leaving for Volantis soon. I want to arrive before Prince Enar's coronation." Tyrion didn't reply. He just stared at the ceiling of the cellar, lost in thought. "No," he thought. "I will try to live until the last breath is left in my lungs." He muttered to himself, regaining his confidence. Volantis, first daughter. Diving into the warm water on a cold night, Enar couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. The water was comfortable and soothing, nothing compared to the pleasure of a hot bath on a frigid evening. The white ivory bathtub faced the balcony, offering a view of the sprawling city of Volantis in all its grandeur. The red towers burned with seemingly unquenchable flames, casting a fiery glow over various parts of the city. Candles flickered around the bathroom, their soft light dancing on the walls and ceiling. Enar looked up at the beautifully painted ceiling and smiled. His coronation was near. In just a few weeks, he would be crowned king in Volantis, a title he intended to reaffirm in King's Landing. Enar Targaryen, first of his name, he muttered to himself. The title bore a weight that was unmatched, yet he had grown accustomed to it. In some inexplicable way, this heavy responsibility kept him grounded, focused, and sharp. Suddenly, the rustle of fabric being removed behind him caught his attention, followed by a sweet, gentle voice. Enar heard her words and smiled. "Of course, share a bath with me tonight, Auntie." The moment he spoke, a figure appeared beside him and Visenya's naked body appeared fully in front of him. In the candlelight, her beauty took Enar's breath away for a moment. He had seen many beautiful women in his life, Kinvara, Catelyn, Belgeir, but they all seemed inferior to the woman before him. She looked like an elf shyly covering her sacred garden with her long silver hair. Her small melons were perfect and her pink nipples were hardened by the cold wind coming from the bathroom balcony. Her immaculate skin looked slightly sweaty in the candlelight, and her violet eyes showed a surprisingly adorable shyness. Visenya felt her cheeks burn like never before. Her heart seemed to explode from her chest. Enar's gaze seemed so intense and hot that it made her skin burn. His gaze traversed every inch of her exposed skin. She quickly dove into the water and sat down next to him in the ivory bathroom. "What do I owe to the pleasure of my beautiful aunt's company this evening?" Enar asked, with a gentle smile on his lips, his eyes radiating kindness. He didn't want Visenya to feel uncomfortable at that moment. Visenya looked at Enar's serene smile and felt her heart calm down, although it was still beating fast. It wasn't easy to stay calm, especially when it was the first time she had seen a naked man, and her future husband at that. "I just came to keep you company, you looked tired." With her cheeks tinged with blush, Visenya replied in a soft, shy tone. Enar's gaze softened as he listened to her words. He could hardly believe that this beautiful, sweet young woman was a warmonger at war, chopping people up like vegetables, but so shy at times like this. "You are adorable." As he approached her, Inar spoke, forcing her to turn her face toward him. He looked into her violet eyes and kissed her lips gently. Visenya was surprised for a moment and wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her naked body against his. Inar's hands automatically wrapped around Visenya's waist, and they both surrendered to the kiss with a warm, enveloping intensity. They both seemed desperate to feel each other's lips, colliding, sucking and biting like there was no tomorrow. They were satisfying each other's decades-old desires as they tasted the intense, hot sensation of the kiss. Surprisingly, Visenya's shyness lasted only for the beginning, as she became bolder and used her hands to explore Inar's body without scruples. While one hand clung to his hair, the other ran down his body. They parted for a moment, both leaning their foreheads against each other and catching their breath. This kiss was better than Dany's. Inar spoke between quick breaths, his lips slightly swollen from the wild kiss. Visenya smiled and seemed to gain an almost supernatural confidence. "Let me wash your body." She spoke in a soft, gentle tone. Inar nodded and allowed it. Visenya took the cloth from beside the ivory bathtub and rubbed it gently against his chest, wiping his skin with care and devotion as she watched his body with a gaze that gradually grew warmer and full of desire. "Inar, you don't have to burden yourself. I will be your queen." As she gently rubbed the silk cloth against his face, Visenya commented as she kissed his lips chastely. "I'm sorry, I've done so many things on my own over the years that I forgot that I now have 2 beautiful wives." Inar replied, stroking Visenya's face with his thumb, gliding slowly over her wet skin. "A Targaryen alone in the world is a terrible thing." Visenya nodded, enjoying the caresses on her face, feeling that in these small gestures he truly cared for her. It wasn't love they both felt at the moment, but companionship, love that would come later in their marriage when they got to know each other better. Perhaps only Daenerys was truly in love with Inar at this moment. "Thank you, I will remember your words, Visenya." Inar spoke, kissing her cheek gently as he pulled her into a tight embrace, their naked bodies fitting perfectly into each other's. Feeling her body and her small melons pressed against his chest, the softness and warmth of them, Inar began to breathe a little faster. Even with the extreme self-control he had over his emotions, he felt a certain part of his body stiffen like never before. "Do you know how much I'm holding back from smashing you right here and now?" Nibbling at Visenya's ear, Inar spoke in a husky voice, full of desire. Visenya let out a soft, sensual moan as she felt the nibbling on her ear. She looked up at Inar with her watery eyes and felt something hard and warm touch her belly, almost like a sword. She knew exactly what it was. She wasn't a child. She was almost 19. Women her age had been married for a long time and had children. But she wasn't ready to consummate her marriage in a bathtub. She wanted a night worthy of a queen with her king, not just a night of passion. She could have endless nights like that in the future, but the first one would always be special. Inar knew that, but that didn't mean they couldn't do something else. Hearing the whisper in her ear, Visenya's cheeks flushed like never before, as red as 2 juicy apples. "I will repay you, my dear queen." Inar whispered again, like a demon tempting his prey to unknowingly fall into the abyss. Visenya looked at Inar with a hesitant look. She was reluctant to continue because she didn't know if she would really make her future husband comfortable, and coupled with her inexperience, she feared to cause more pain than pleasure. But seeing Inar's encouraging and increasingly tender gaze, she gradually began to kneel before him, keeping her gaze fixed on his eyes. What followed was something Inar loved every moment of. Seeing that adorable, innocent face do something so indecent made his sense of conquest rise to simply astronomical levels. Stroking her silver hair lovingly, Inar enjoyed the feel of her mouth as he closed his eyes. He was in heaven. Seeing Visenya return from her long bath, Daenerys quickly jumped out of bed and asked with a curious look, "Tell me all the details, sister." Visenya's face instantly turned red as she remembered the events in the bathroom. How could she tell her sister and mother that she had done something so shameful and unworthy of a princess? However, she had to admit that she enjoyed every moment of it, especially when Inar knelt before her and did as he had promised. Knowing that she had the power to make the most powerful man in the world kneel and do those shameful things certainly made her sense of conquest grow like never before. "Daenerys, stop pestering your sister. She certainly doesn't want to talk about it," Riella commented, seeing the embarrassment on her daughter's face. She was a grown woman. How could she not know what could happen in a bathroom? Especially when two lustful young men were involved. However, when she saw her daughter's normal walk, she knew that her daughter still retained her purity, for which she thanked her beloved grandson. How could a queen have her first time in a mere bathtub? Daenerys rolled her eyes, but didn't ask what had happened in the bathroom again, though she was curious. If it hadn't been for her mother's insistence, she would have wanted to go in Visenya's place. But as her mother had said, they both needed equal time alone with Enar. Something Daenerys agreed to. She didn't want to be like Queen Rhaenys and Queen Visenya. Aegon spent a day with Visenya and 10 days with Rhaenys. She'd heard the stories and didn't want that to happen to her and her sister. Volantis, at night. Enar was in his room wearing only baggy silk pants. His purple eyes focused on the paper in his hand. The quill with its ink-soaked tip was gradually drawing the outline of something completely impossible for people on this planet to figure out what it really was. With her head resting on his lap, Daenerys, wearing a transparent pink nightgown, was on her stomach, swinging her feet up and down as she looked at the drawing with a curious gaze. In her eyes, the drawing showed what she could sum up as a dragon made of iron, but much fatter and with intimidating spikes. Leaving Enar's lap, Daenerys went to his back and hugged him from behind while wrapping her arms around his neck. She rested her chin on his shoulder and saw more clearly the scrawl being drawn on the paper in black ink. "What is it?" "It looks like a very ugly, fat iron dragon," she asked, her lilac eyes filled with a curiosity that was almost impossible to contain. Enar let out a laugh hearing her question. Stopping painting, he took the girl in his arms and showed her the paper. "It's a space cruiser. Imagine it as a ship that flies and spits fire," he explained as he pointed to the drawing on the paper. "Can that exist?" she asked with a perplexed expression. In her mind, only dragons could have that kind of power, but here she was seeing something that could have that same power. How could she not be confused and incredulous? "It will come into existence 500 years from now," Enar replied with a soft tone. His purple eyes seemed to glow with a phosphorescent radiance. Seeing that glow, Daenerys knew that her nephew was having a vision of the future. "What a shame, I wanted to see it for myself," she muttered to herself. She really wanted to see a ship capable of flying through the air. "You'll see." Enar kissed her forehead tenderly and spoke in a gentle tone. Daenerys looked confusedly at Enar. How could she live 500 years? Seeing her cute expression, Enar smiled and spoke. "You, me, Visenya, and all our family will live longer than any other humans in the world." He continued, "This planet is just the beginning, Daenerys. One day we will leave it and venture into the stars. We will be the gods for our people as we pave the way for the eternal prosperity of the human race. Do you want to see?" Enar asked, looking at Daenerys with a calm gaze. Daenerys nodded silently as she closed her eyes. Enar reached out and gently touched Daenerys' forehead with the tip of his finger, transferring some fragments of memories he had seen in the future. Planets, other civilizations, and thousands of different races. An endless war full of death and horror. And at the end of it all, a ruby throne could be seen, and sitting on it was someone Daenerys knew very well. Her beloved nephew. Opening her eyes, Daenerys couldn't help but open her mouth and desperately suck air into her lungs. She looked at Enar with a frightened gaze, but that fear vanished the moment she saw the purple eyes looking back at her with a calm, determined gaze, and with a sense of confidence that was simply unshakable. Holding Daenerys' face in his right hand, Enar used his thumb to stroke her cheek, calming her with this gesture. "It's all right, we'll walk this path together." He spoke, his tone so gentle and warm that it made the fear for the future completely disappear from her mind. "Together and forever together," Daenerys said, hugging Enar tightly, who just smiled and hugged her back. "Yes, forever together," Enar answered in her ear with a determined tone. Visenya's words the night before had made him stop wanting to do everything alone. He had people by his side who could carry some of the burden he was carrying. Enar assumed that if he remained as he was before, he would gradually become indifferent to everything and everyone, having only one purpose in life: to take humanity to a peak never seen or thought of by any other human. But would he still be himself, or just a puppet for the omnipotent and omniscient God? "What's that?" I don't remember having anything like that in the room before. Hearing Daenerys' question, Enar followed her voice and saw that on a wooden chest of drawers, a delicate glass vial could be seen. Inside the vial was a thick turquoise liquid. Enar's eyes narrowed at the sight of the glass vial with the suspicious liquid inside. A name appeared in his mind. Water of Life. Leaving Daenerys on the bed, Enar got off the bed and picked up the vial, looking at it intently. The prince knew exactly who, or rather what, had sent it to him. The omnipotent and omniscient God. A reward for following the path you've paved for me? Enar muttered, wanting to throw that jar against the wall and destroy it. Your face looks strange. What happened, Enar? Daenerys, who had gotten out of bed, walked across the cold floor in her bare feet and asked, coming to his side. It was the first time she had seen that expression on her nephew's face. She had always seen that Enar was always calm with a smile on his face no matter what the news, but now she saw an expression of anger, almost a feeling of pure fury in his expression. Hearing Daenerys' worried voice, Enar's turbulent mood calmed down in an instant. He looked at her and pulled her into a tight embrace. Laying his head in the crook of her neck, Enar gradually calmed down, smelling the faint scent of lavender coming from the Planetos after their bath. It's nothing, just a present from a nasty guy. Enar answered her earlier question with an amused laugh. Daenerys frowned, but didn't continue asking. She knew that Enar was hiding something from her, but she didn't go on to ask what it was. She didn't want the trust they had just established to be tested by a few mere questions. If she had to know, Daenerys was sure that Enar would tell her everything. Like her, he hated lies. After all, as her mother had said, a relationship is based on mutual trust. Guessing Daenerys' thoughts, Enar couldn't help but smile. He kissed her cheek and mentally thanked her for having such an understanding wife. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk about the omnipotent and omniscient God, but what he was planning was best left to him alone for the time being. Returning to the bed with Daenerys in his arms, Enar gently placed the young woman on the bed and lay down beside her. It was Daenerys' day to spend the night with him, something that Daenerys and Visenya had arranged between them, and he was grateful. Finding the most comfortable position on his chest, Daenerys rested her head on his chest and asked with a hopeful tone, Enar, will I be able to create a ship that flies? Enar was surprised for a moment, but then smiled with satisfaction. Daenerys could very well choose to be an idle queen, but she chose to improve rather than settle for what she had at the moment, which pleased him. Although I don't know how to make a flying ship either, I can teach you what I do know. Enar naturally didn't know how to make a space cruiser. The Earth he had lived on was still normal and far from special exploration, but he had an in-depth knowledge of physics, quantum physics, and other knowledge. His time in the hospital bed was spent with nothing but books, the only way for him to entertain himself. Unfortunately, that damned disease even took his only happiness. Daenerys' eyes shone with a touch of emotion, but then she thought of something very worrying. Enar, if flying ships exist, haven't dragons become obsolete? Enar smiled at the very important question for their future. Of course not. While science evolves, magic won't be left behind. Dragons have become stronger with blood magic. We will make them true gods capable of destroying stars. Daenerys didn't doubt a word Enar said. She practically had blind and absolute trust in Enar. Just as Enar and Daenerys were getting ready for bed, someone knocked on the door. Your Grace, Archbishop Bonero has sent word that the ship carrying the representatives of House Martell has docked in the harbor. Enar heard Titus' voice behind the door and couldn't help but be surprised. It looks like we'll be going to the throne room to welcome our guests from afar. Enar spoke with an amused tone. Daenerys rolled her eyes, but she was also curious about the famous House Martell. Enar was sitting on a throne made of cold metal, but painted red. He was wearing black clothes with the coat of arms of House Targaryen. On his head, he wore a diadem of Valyrian steel with round rubies. It was a crown similar to that of Aegon I Targaryen, but obviously a replica. In the perfectly lit throne room there was not only Enar, Daenerys was present, just a few steps away from him, sitting on a chair ornamented with gold and silver, a much more comfortable throne than the one Enar was sitting on at the moment. To match Enar, Daenerys wore a blood-red dress with the coat of arms of House Targaryen in black. On her head, She wore a delicate and beautiful crown studded with beautiful rubies. Although they weren't both kings and queens at the moment because they hadn't been crowned properly, they were unmatched king and queen at the moment. In addition to the two of them, Titus, Sigmund, and Willem were present, all wearing white armor and white capes. Under their command, dozens of guards wearing red armor were lined up side by side in the long corridor leading to the thrones above the white steps. Standing on the first steps, Kinvara in her beautiful red dress looked up at the throne with a calm and composed gaze, an elegant smile on her lips. Visenya and Riella were not present, something Einar had asked for. Both women were tired of helping him all day to deal with the hundreds of documents concerning the governance of Volantis. How could Einar disturb the sleep of both women because of a visit from foreigners, even if those foreigners were his allies? Your Grace, the captain of the Emperor's daughters requests an audience as a matter of urgency. Kinvara spoke, drawing the attention of Einar and Daenerys. Daenerys in particular looked at her with even more curiosity. Einar wasn't hiding anything from her, including some secret organizations like the Emperor's Daughters, an intelligence and assassination organization composed only of women trained by extremely brutal means, forging women capable of killing 5 men with 1 dagger. What's more, according to Einar, she would be in charge of the Emperor's Daughters. In other words, she would command this entire secret organization. In Einar's words, she only had to report to him and no one else. Honestly, this thrilled her. She had already noticed that she wasn't suited to taking part in wars given her small size. Although she gained in agility, she didn't have infinite stamina, and when her stamina ran out, death would be the only fate awaiting her. As the leader of the future organization of the Emperor's Daughters, she felt that she wouldn't be as bored and with nothing to do as many might expect her to be. Send her in. Resting the gourd in his hand, Einar replied with a touch of interest growing in her eyes. It wasn't normal to disturb him in the night, especially so late at night. With Einar's words, a secret passage appeared behind a pillar, revealing a figure dressed completely in black. There wasn't a scrap of skin exposed on her, only a pair of brown, almost black eyes could be seen. The woman walked under the marble floor under the watchful eyes of all the guards, especially Titus and Sigmund. Although both had not received extensive combat training, the brothers were not something to be underestimated, especially with their speed and abnormal strength. Both could kill dozens of men without any difficulty. The woman knelt below the steps and looked directly at her Messiah. It is an honor to meet you in person, Son of Light. She spoke with a devout and calm tone. Forgive me for disturbing your sacred rest, but the information I received was of extreme urgency. Don't worry, Vivian. Don't hesitate to do your work as you've been taught. I don't care about my rest. Einar looked at the mysterious woman before him and commented with a rare tone of appreciation. He liked people like that, not relaxing in their work. He couldn't relax. How could his subordinates relax before his master? Yes, Prophet. Vivian answered respectfully, but was shocked inside. The Daughters of the Emperor had thousands of members. She had never expected that her name would be remembered by the Son of Light. She was just one of hundreds of captains in the organization. Our spies in Westeros at the Red Keep sent messages that the small council met dozens of times last month. Although it was impossible to hear the conversation, since only members or great nobles can enter the small council chamber. Given the rumors we've spread throughout the capital about the Prophet, it's likely that this was the main subject of the Little Council's constant meetings. Vivian spoke in a calm tone and continued. The reason for the rush to report this information was that the Master of Coin called Peter, also known as Littlefinger, is desperately gathering gold for House Baratheon's coffers. Einar understood the urgency of the situation. A large collection of money might seem harmless, but it absolutely was not. What did Robert urgently need money for? Einar eliminated the most obvious reasons, and one in particular popped into his mind. He wants to hire assassins to kill me. And the only assassins who could be that expensive are the faceless assassins of the Black and White House of Bravos. Einar muttered to himself, guessing Robert's, or rather Tywin Lannister's, intentions. Although Einar whispered, his words were particularly audible to everyone in the Great Hall. Daenerys for the first time showed an expression of anger at hearing the whisper of her sweet future husband. A flame of fury and rage bubbled up in her chest, threatening to explode at any moment. Although she knew it would happen, She was still furious at the Fat King's malicious intentions. Her hands gripped the arms of the throne tightly. She promised herself that she wouldn't let Einar get hurt in front of any dirty, cruel murderer. Titus and Sigmund looked at each other and nodded. Although they had to train, protecting Einar was the most important thing to them. He was the reason they were both alive. He gave them a glorious goal that was truly worth fighting and dying for. Einar turned them into humans again. They were no longer insignificant beggars living on the streets with no purpose who would probably survive by robbing and murdering. Bonero and Kinvara in particular were even more furious. Robert's actions were no different from a highest act of blasphemy anyone could commit. Your Grace, let me lead the fleet of ships to attack the coast of Westeros. Prevent any ships from crossing the sea. Bonero ordered, looking towards Einar, sitting on the red throne. Proposal denied. Einar refused without any hesitation, making the middle-aged man look extremely sad. This murder is a good thing. It gave me the justification to dirty his name and glorify mine even more. Seeing everyone's expressions, including Daenerys, Einar explained patiently. Vivian, go and spread the news of the assassination attempt orchestrated by Robert Baratheon. Tell them that as well as being a murderer of kin, their Fat King was a cowardly man who doesn't have the courage to fight on a battlefield. Tell them what their real king is like. Einar spoke each word with a calm expression. Honestly, the assassination attempt was expected by him. After all, he had a dragon and a large army. Only a fool would stand by and wait for something like this to knock on the door. Einar could very well use the assassination attempt to benefit him even more. Undermine Robert's reputation among the people and use it to spread his name. With that, at least his future rule will be smoother at first without so much mistrust on the part of the people. They will accept him more easily and quickly. Something very essential in the future for the war against the others. Daenerys looked at Einar in surprise and couldn't help feeling that she was still very inexperienced when it came to being cunning. She could never have thought that suffering an assassination attempt could bring so many benefits. With the amount of murders she had suffered growing up, she could well have become legendary in the eyes of the people of Essos. In the port of Volantis, a huge ship with no coat of arms was docked. Uncle, is Volantis in the same shape as you saw it on your last visit? Arianne asked, looking at the gigantic red towers burning brightly. The city seemed alive, even at night, with people coming and going in a hurry. It's very different. In the old days, this city smelled like a sweaty old bitch, Oberyn replied, looking at the city he had visited 7 years ago. It really was very different from what he remembered, especially the people, whom he had always considered strange. Oberyn's comparison made Arianne and all his daughters laugh. His mistress, Ilaria, took his arm and subtly pointed forward with her eyes. Oberyn followed his lover's gaze and saw troops approaching. They were all wearing red armor and looked powerful. It wasn't a new army that had never taken part in a war. The soldiers in front of him were experienced and had seen war, steel, and blood up close. A truly powerful army. According to Doran's spies, Oberyn knew that this army had fought against a horde of 40,000 Dothraki, not to mention the army of mercenaries. It was a great achievement, given that he knew the Dothraki and the mercenaries better than anyone. After all, he himself had been the general of a group of mercenaries. However, it was the man leading the soldiers who caught Oberyn's eye. He was a middle-aged man, tall and thin. His skin was black as tar, darker than coal or jet. He was a monster of a man, huge, over 6 feet tall and as wide as 2 men. A tangle of pure white hair grew around his face like a lion's mane. Makoro, the black flame of Volantis. Oberyn recognized the man in an instant. There was no way not to. The Desert Prince saw the guards he had brought from Dorne position themselves between them, stopping the advance of the red-armored soldiers. Welcome to Volantis, Prince Oberyn Martell and Princess Arianne Martell. I am Makoro, a red bishop. Makoro ignored the Dorne guards and spoke with a calm and compassionate tone, but his voice was deep and thunderous. I didn't announce my arrival in advance, Priest Makoro, Oberyn said. I would like to know how you anticipated our arrival. This was a top-secret trip. Doran and Oberyn had planned it for months so as not to attract the attention of anyone in Westeros. Yet there they were, in front of an entourage ready to welcome them. Makoro looked at Oberyn and smiled mysteriously. "I saw you in the flames, Prince Oberyn. I saw your ship leave Dorne and go through the storm in the dark night." Oberyn narrowed his eyes and glared at the man. He really didn't like magic. It always turned simple things into something complicated. Couldn't the man simply answer the question by saying, "Spies"? Now he would really get paranoid about a lot of things. "Really surprising to see the future through the flames," Oberyn replied in a dry, slightly deep tone. "You'll see that this is just one of the countless blessings that the omnipotent and omniscient Lord has bestowed upon us, his lost lambs in a sea of suffering." Makoro spoke as he gestured for everyone to follow him. Oberyn felt his heart squeeze at those words. He really didn't like magic. "Thank you for the welcome, Makoro. I assume we'll be well received by our prince and future king." Arianne, with the highest status in the entourage, took the initiative to speak to the Red Bishop. "The Prince of Light awaits you in the throne room." Makoro replied with a devout and extremely respectful tone at the mention of Enar. That look wasn't one of admiration. It was pure reverence, as if he were talking about a god, not a prince or king. Arianne thought as she observed the expression of the black-skinned, white-haired man in front of her. This only confirmed that the Red Faith saw Prince Enar as a god, or his representative on Earth. Arianne then understood that the Red Faith and Prince Enar were preparing for something much bigger than the Iron Throne and Westeros. As they walked through the streets of Volantis, Arianne and Oberyn noticed men and women kneeling on a large cloth. They were praying, bowing and rising. Their religious whispers filled the air. If it had been just one group, they wouldn't have been surprised. But a crowd in front of them was doing the same, all at the same time. Noticing Oberyn and Arianne's gazes, Makoro explained in a gentle tone, despite the serious expression on his face. "They are praying for the grace of our God to fall upon them. Many are on pilgrimage from all corners of Essos. They all want to see our prophet, the Messiah who will lead the world along a sacred path. They don't really think Prince Enar can perform miracles, do they?" Obara, Oberyn's eldest daughter, asked with an incredulous expression on hearing Bishop Makoro's words. Makoro looked at the incredulous woman before him and snorted coldly, expressing his dissatisfaction, but said nothing. Oberyn noticed this and gave his daughter a stern look. He couldn't believe that she had actually dared to say something against a religious figure in a city full of fanatics. Nymeria looked at her sister and couldn't help but sigh. She really had to talk to her sister about always keeping her doubts to herself. Always ask something when they are absolutely alone with no one around. Nymeria looked at her sister and couldn't help but sigh. She really needed to talk to her sister so that she would always keep her doubts to herself, asking them only when they were absolutely alone, with no one around. "Forgive my daughter, Bishop Makoro. She is young and has not yet seen enough of the world." Oberyn, despite his appearance suggesting that he would settle things by force, was unexpectedly diplomatic. "She's forgiven, but avoid speaking ill of the prophet, or your heads may appear on spears the next morning. It won't be the Red Faith that does that, but the faithful." Makoro replied in a calm tone. Oberyn nodded and didn't doubt his words. He was an experienced man who had seen how murderous and cruel the faith could be. Religious intolerance was something truly frightening. Casting one last glance at his daughters, as a warning to them to remain silent, Oberyn finally found himself in front of a large red temple. Before entering the Great Temple, Makoro warned, "Follow me and don't get lost. At this hour, the Great Temple is very dangerous for strangers. The guards have orders to kill if necessary." "Really cozy," Obara whispered to the sisters, causing Nymeria and Tyene to roll their eyes at the bad joke at that moment. Ilaria looked at the girls and couldn't help but sigh, but still walked with dignity beside Oberyn. Oberyn and Arianne finally found themselves in front of gigantic doors. On them, they both saw drawings of a large red sun, held by a giant dressed in a cloak of the same color. However, their attention was soon captured by the sound of the doors opening. Then Oberyn and Arianne heard Makoro announce his entrance. "Messiah, before you stand Princess Arianne Martell, heir to the throne of Dorne, and her uncle, Prince Oberyn Martell, along with his noble wife and daughters." Makoro spoke aloud and entered the throne room, gesturing for everyone to follow him. Ilaria and Oberyn's 3 daughters were surprised to be announced along with Oberyn and Arianne. They had never been introduced in this way before. After all, Ilaria wasn't Oberyn's wife, and his 3 daughters were bastards. When Oberyn and Arianne entered the throne room, they saw a long line of knights lined up next to the pillars, following them to the end of the corridor. At the end, ivory steps rose up, and at the top of them, 2 thrones could be seen. Oberyn raised his head and looked at the central throne. On it sat a young man of around 17, although he knew that the prince was only 12. This made the Prince of Dorne wonder what Eddard Stark had fed the boy. He had white gold hair and purple eyes. His face was really handsome, inhumanly handsome. It was as if Prince Enar were a Valyrian thoroughbred. And just as the description said, they were inhumanly beautiful. Looking directly at Prince Enar's face, and after analyzing every detail, the last vestige of doubt about the young man's identity disappeared completely from Oberyn's mind. The boy was practically Rhaegar, with only a few differences, such as the color of his eyes, his hair and the shape of his chin. Enar was Rhaegar's son. No doubt about it. Welcome, Princess Arianne and Prince Oberyn. The arrival of House Martell has brightened these halls. I have ordered your quarters to be properly prepared for your stay in Volantis. Looking at Oberyn's shocked face, Enar smiled gently and spoke, observing the whole of House Martell, including the famous sand snakes. If Arianne were an innocent and inexperienced maiden like all the lattice of Westeros, the moment her eyes fell on him, she would fall in love with him with absolute certainty. Arianne mentally thanked Lyanna Stark for bringing the world such a blessing for women, while cursing how cruel the gods were for making someone so perfect and beautiful. Even with all her resistance to handsome men, Arianne supposed that if she spent some time with the prince, she would be cruelly taken by him and fall deeply in love with him. His voice was melodious and soft, yet regal, like music to Arianne's ears. Arianne kept a sensual smile on her lips as she listened to Prince Targaryen's words. My stay would be more enjoyable with you in my bed, taking my purity and smashing me like a bitch, Prince. How I would love to feel my lips wrapping around your schlong. She thought, lost in reverie as she imagined Enar's heavenly voice moaning at the touch of her mouth and tongue. Arianne felt the area between her legs heat up at the thought of seducing the prince into her bed. Thank you, my prince. I hope the alliance between House Martell and House Targaryen will last forever. Arianne replied politely, hiding her lustful thoughts behind a modest, elegant smile. Forever. Enar whispered to himself, his purple eyes seeming to glow for a moment. He rested his head on his hand and looked at Princess Arianne with a calm gaze. I really hope the alliance between our houses lasts forever. I'd hate to do something I don't like doing. Oberyn and Arianne narrowed their eyes at the same time, Enar's words containing a subtle threat to Dorne. At the same time, they understood that they weren't dealing with a 12-year-old, but with a 12-year-old capable of reducing an entire city of millions into a dead city. Betrayal meant death. Oberyn smiled, despite the discontent in his heart, although he knew that this was Enar's way of showing strength to him and House Martell's gentle submission, but he really didn't like the threat against Dorne. I wonder when your grace would begin your reconquest of Westeros? Oberyn asked, looking at Enar sitting elegantly on the throne. He really couldn't believe he was seeing a man who had been raised as a bastard all his life. Every gesture, every look, every word and aura he made emanated a regal, princely feeling. Was House Stark's upbringing really so good as to create a true king? Year 296 after the conquest. Enar didn't hesitate to answer. The only reason he was delaying the reconquest was that he wanted to see the continent in chaos before he began to carry out his plans. He would confront Robert at the right time and decapitate his cousin's head along with the others. 1 year and 5 months. Oberyn muttered to himself. Although he didn't know why the prince wanted to postpone the reconquest for a year and a half, Oberyn didn't say anything or advise him to change his strategies. He had only just met the young prince. How could he give advice on something so important without even having the king's trust in the first place? Will Dorne be at my side in the war? Enar asked again, his lips curving into a smile that made all the women present look up at least once. Daenerys, noticing the looks on the other women's faces, was proud of Enar. In her eyes, Only a mediocre man couldn't get women's attention. The more women Einar attracted, the more it meant that he was a great man. However, she didn't like the way some of these women looked at her husband. Especially the Princess of Dorne. She could hide her lust shamelessly behind a facade of elegance and innocence, but Daenerys' eyes could see through her disguise and see her true nature. Dorne will stand by your grace in the war, as will House Stark, I hope. Oberyn replied without any hesitation. There could be no hesitation in his actions at this moment. Anything like that could arouse the young prince's antipathy and distrust. As a prince, Oberyn knew all too well that rulers were full of suspicion and had huge egos, that the slightest disrespect could have disastrous consequences for Dorne and House Martell. 3 great houses, a dragon and an army of 40,000. I'm better than Aegon at the moment. Einar let out a laugh and joked, making the whole throne room feel more relaxed. It showed how powerful being a king was, your mood being able to influence your surroundings unconsciously. Einar wasn't surprised by this and found it very normal. It was the power of social influence being exerted on others. It was strange, but people are naturally submissive to others when they meet someone stronger. The concept of equality is so widespread in modern society that people forget that the strongest and most influential people always control their lives from their own governments. Instead of the government fearing the people, it was the people who feared their government. Suddenly, Einar felt an intense gaze fall on him. He followed the source of the gaze and saw a girl with pale blonde hair down to her shoulders. Her eyes were an icy shade of gray and her face was more androgynous than feminine. Looking at the sword at her waist, Einar narrowed his eyes. There was no way he wouldn't recognize one of the 3 legendary swords of Westeros. Dawn. Do you wish to speak, milady? Einar asked with a growing interest in his gaze. Under everyone's watchful eyes, the not particularly tall girl stepped forward and knelt down below the steps. I am Leda Dane, the current sword of the morning of House Dane. Leda spoke, raising her head and looking at Einar with her icy gray eyes. There was no expression on her face, just an inexpressive feeling. Just as my uncle became a Kingsguard, I wished to follow in his footsteps. Daenerys couldn't help but look at the girl with a surprised look. She looked at the sword at the girl's waist and saw that it really was Dawn at her waist. However, in the books she had read about Westeros, there was no record of a woman from House Dane wielding the legendary sword Dawn. Einar spoke after a brief silence. You will abandon your titles and possessions. You will not be able to exercise your function as a woman, and you will never be able to have a husband. It will be a sword to protect me, a tool and nothing more. So, I ask you again. Are you sure of your decision, Leda Dane? Einar asked, rising from his throne and descending step by step, his purple eyes fixed on the cold gray eyes of the girl in front of him. Everyone held their breath for fear of missing what was about to happen. As Einar had said, being part of the Kingsguard wasn't just about joining any order of knights. It was about the knight ceasing to be an individual and becoming a sword to protect the king and nothing more. My body, mind, and soul are yours, your grace. Leda replied without any hesitation, causing Einar's lips to curve into a smile. Give me your sword. Einar ordered, and Leda drew Dawn from its scabbard in a mere instant. The moment she drew her sword, 2 swords appeared at her neck. If the swords advanced any further, Leda's head would be cut straight off. It was Titus and Sigmund, both of whom had acted at the same moment. Leda's eyes for the first time showed some emotion other than respect for Einar. There was a warlike look in her eyes, full of the thrill of battle. She almost didn't see the swords of the teenagers in front of her being drawn. It all happened in a mere instant, and the swords were already dangerously close to her neck. Oberyn couldn't have been more shocked. He only saw 2 fleeting lights from the air, and 2 teenagers had surrounded Leda with their swords close to her neck. It shocked him to the core. Was that speed of movement really something humans could do? Fall back, Titus and Sigmund. Einar ordered with a simple wave of his hand, something the brothers obeyed without hesitation and stepped back. But his gaze hadn't left Leda. If she tried anything, they would kill her in an instant. They're too protective of me. Einar said with a laugh, oblivious to the slightly tense atmosphere. "I'll do exactly the same job as them, my king. I will protect you with my life and all my devotion." Leda replied with a cold but respectful look towards Enar. Enar smiled and commented in an amused tone, "You really do look like your father." Leda's hands trembled for a brief moment at the mention of her father, but she was soon calm again. Enar couldn't help but find her reaction amusing. Yes, Leda was his cousin. To be precise, she was the bastard daughter of Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell and Lady Asheradane of Starfall.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.